detective's hands trembled slightly as she pulled into the driveway of the modest ranch house on Alameda Avenue. It was early morning, March 15th, 2024, and the sky above Denver held that crystalline quality peculiar to Colorado Springs, where the air feels thin enough to cut. Detective Sarah Mitchell had been with the department for 19 years, but she'd carried this particular case file for only 8 months. The man inside had lived here for 37 years. He'd coached Little League. He'd volunteered at the church pancake breakfasts. His neighbors described him as quiet, helpful, the kind of person who shoveled your sidewalk without being asked. In 14 minutes, she would knock on his door and arrest him for the murder of 17-year-old Jennifer Holbrook, whose body had been found in a drainage ditch off Highway 36 on February 8, 1987. The arrest would send shockwaves through a community that thought it knew everyone. The arrest would answer a question that had haunted a family for 37 years. The arrest would prove that monsters don't always look like monsters, and that justice, though glacially slow, sometimes finds its way home. Mitchell sat in her unmarked sedan reviewing the case file one more time, though she'd memorized every detail weeks ago. The photographs were difficult to look at even now, after nearly 2 decades in law enforcement. Jennifer Holbrook smiling in her senior portrait, blonde hair feathered perfectly, eyes bright with the particular optimism of 17-year-olds who believe the future stretches infinitely before them. Then the crime scene photos, which Mitchell had forced herself to study because Jennifer deserved that respect, deserved someone willing to look at what had been done to her without flinching away. The contrast between those 2 sets of images told the entire story of what Robert Keller had stolen. Not just a life, but all the lives that life would have touched, the students Jennifer would have taught, the children she might have raised, the friendships and love affairs and ordinary Tuesday afternoons that accumulate into a human existence. Keller had taken all of it in a span of minutes, satisfying whatever dark impulse had driven him that night, and then he'd gone home to his family and lived 37 years as though nothing had happened. The house before her was unremarkable in every way. Single-story ranch with beige siding and brown trim, the kind of house that populated suburban neighborhoods across America in the 1970s and 80s. The lawn was neatly maintained, flower beds mulched and ready for spring planting. An American flag hung from a pole mounted beside the front door. A bird feeder in the front yard attracted sparrows and finches. Everything about the property suggested a man who took care of his home, who valued order and presentation, who wanted to appear respectable to his neighbors. Mitchell wondered if that need for appearance had always been part of Keller's psychology, if the neat lawn and the volunteer work had been deliberate camouflage for what he really was, or if he'd genuinely believed himself to be a good person despite what he'd done to Jennifer. Psychologists called it compartmentalization, the ability to separate different aspects of oneself so completely that contradictions could coexist without creating cognitive dissonance. Robert Keller had apparently been a master at it. Mitchell's partner, Detective James Rodriguez, sat in the passenger seat, running through the arrest protocol one more time. They'd gone over it a dozen times already, but Rodriguez was thorough to the point of obsessiveness, which made him an excellent detective. They had backup units positioned 2 blocks away, ready to respond if Keller resisted or tried to flee, though neither detective expected that. Keller was 72 years old, with no history of violence beyond the single incident they could prove. More likely he would be shocked, would perhaps deny everything, would call for a lawyer, or perhaps he would confess. Mitchell had seen both responses from suspects confronted with DNA evidence decades after their crimes. Some maintained their innocence even in the face of scientific certainty, constructing elaborate explanations for how their DNA might have transferred innocently to a victim they claimed never to have met. Others seemed almost relieved, as though carrying the secret for so many years had become its own burden, as though some part of them wanted to finally acknowledge what they'd done. Jennifer Marie Holbrook woke up at 6:15 on the morning of February 7th, 1987. Her mother, Patricia, would later remember hearing the shower running, hearing Jennifer singing something off-key, something by Madonna probably, because Jennifer loved Madonna that winter. She was a senior at Thornton High School, 3 months from graduation. She had been accepted to the University of Northern Colorado, wanted to study elementary education, wanted to teach second grade, because she said that was the age when kids still thought learning was magic. She had blonde hair that she wore feathered in that quintessentially 80s style, and blue eyes that her father said looked like lake water on sunny days. She had a birthmark shaped like a comma on her left shoulder blade. She was allergic to strawberries. She collected ceramic horses and kept them arranged on a shelf above her desk in order of size. She had worked that entire school year at a Dairy Queen on 88th Avenue, saving money for college, saving money for a car, saving money for a future that stretched out before her with the infinite possibility that 17-year-olds sometimes still believe in. Patricia Holbrook had been 39 years old that February morning, young enough to still feel young herself, old enough to feel proud that her eldest daughter was on the cusp of adulthood. She'd been making coffee in the kitchen the same morning. Rituals she performed every weekday, listening to the sounds of her house waking up. Jennifer's younger sister, Amy, still asleep because Amy could sleep through anything and never woke before she absolutely had to. Robert, Patricia's husband, already gone to his construction job because his crew started at 7 and the site was 40 minutes away. Just Patricia and the coffee maker and the sound of Jennifer's shower, the sound of Jennifer's off-key singing, sounds so ordinary they barely registered as sounds at all, just the background noise of a life being lived. Patricia had been thinking about whether she needed to stop at the grocery store after work, whether they had enough milk, whether she should make spaghetti or tacos for dinner. Thoughts so mundane they evaporated the moment she thought them. The mental white noise that fills the spaces between significant moments. She had no way of knowing that this was one of the last normal mornings she would ever experience, that by the next morning normalcy would have shattered so completely she would never fully reclaim it. Jennifer came downstairs at 6:45. Her mother was making coffee. Her father had already left for his construction job. Jennifer poured cereal, Frosted Flakes, ate standing at the counter because she was always running late, always moving. She wore acid-washed jeans and a pink sweater, the sweater Patricia had given her for Christmas 2 months earlier, soft cotton with a cowl neck that Jennifer said made her feel sophisticated. She grabbed her backpack, already packed with textbooks and homework, and the spiral notebook where she doodled during classes she found boring. She had a chemistry test that day, Patricia would later remember, because Jennifer had been studying the night before, muttering about periodic tables and molecular bonds, claiming she'd never use any of this information in real life. Patricia had told her education was about more than immediate utility, was about training your mind to think and learn and solve problems. Jennifer had rolled her eyes in the way teenagers do when parents say things that are probably true but annoying. She kissed her mother on the cheek. She said she'd be home by 10 because her shift at Dairy Queen ended at 9:30 and it was only a 15-minute drive. She said she loved her. Patricia said she loved her too, said it automatically. The way you say things you've said 10,000 times, words that have become ritual rather than conscious declaration. Patricia would replay this moment countless times in the years that followed, would examine every detail as though scrutiny might reveal something she'd missed, some warning sign, some opportunity to change what happened next. But there was nothing. It was just a normal morning, a normal goodbye between mother and daughter who expected to see each other again in 15 hours. Jennifer walked out the front door at 7:03 in the morning, and those were the last words Patricia Holbrook heard her daughter speak. The last image was Jennifer's back as she walked toward her car, backpack slung over one shoulder, blonde hair catching the early morning light. Then Jennifer got into her powder blue Malibu, backed out of the driveway, and drove away toward a day that would be her last. Jennifer's car was a 1979 Chevy Malibu, powder blue, with a tape deck she'd installed herself, using instructions from a library book and tools borrowed from her father. She was proud of that tape deck, proud that she'd figured out the wiring, that she could listen to her Madonna and Cyndi Lauper and Whitney Houston while she drove. The car itself had been a gift for her 16th birthday, purchased used from a neighbor who was upgrading to something newer. It had 87,000 miles on it, and a rust spot on the rear passenger door that Jennifer had covered with a bumper sticker that said, "Visualize world peace." The interior smelled like the strawberry air freshener she kept hanging from the rearview mirror, mixed with the particular scent of old car upholstery that had absorbed years of whoever had owned it before. Jennifer loved that car with the intensity teenagers love their first vehicles, loved the freedom it represented, the ability to go places without depending on parents or friends with licenses. She kept it relatively clean, rarely left trash accumulating, made sure to check the oil when her father reminded her. She drove to school. She attended her classes. At lunch, she sat with her best friend, Amanda Reeves, and they talked about prom, which was 2 months away, and about whether Jennifer should go with Derek Patterson, who had asked her the previous week. Amanda thought Jennifer should say yes, because Derek was sweet, and they'd been friends since sophomore year, and what was the harm in going to prom with someone she genuinely liked, even if she wasn't sure she wanted to date him seriously. Jennifer was less certain. She worried that going to prom together would make Derek think she wanted more than friendship. Worried about hurting his feelings when she left for college in the fall. Worried about all the ways things could get complicated. Amanda said Jennifer overthought everything, which was true. Jennifer had always been a worrier, had always imagined all possible outcomes and consequences before making decisions. It was part of what would have made her a good teacher, that ability to think through scenarios and anticipate problems. But it also meant she sometimes paralyzed herself with what-ifs, sometimes missed opportunities because she was too busy analyzing them. They'd made plans to see a movie that weekend, Jennifer and Amanda and a few other friends from school. Some new comedy that was supposed to be hilarious. Jennifer had been looking forward to it all week, had already decided she'd wear her new jeans and the denim jacket she'd found at a thrift store. These were the plans and thoughts occupying her mind that day. Ordinary teenager concerns, prom and movies and chemistry tests, and whether she could afford to buy the new Madonna album when it came out next month. She had no reason to be afraid. Thornton in 1987 was a relatively safe suburb, the kind of place where people still left their doors unlocked, where children played outside until dark without parents hovering. There had been no recent attacks, no warnings about anyone dangerous in the area. Jennifer had made the drive between school and home and work hundreds of times without incident. She'd been trained in stranger danger the way all kids of that era were trained, had been told not to accept rides from people she didn't know, not to go anywhere with someone who made her uncomfortable. But she'd never been taught that danger could come from someone who seemed completely ordinary, someone who didn't look or act like the strangers in the warnings. After school, she went home, changed into her Dairy Queen uniform, the red polo shirt with the white collar, the visor she hated because it flattened her hair. She'd complained about that visor to her mother probably 50 times, said it made her look ridiculous, said she didn't understand why they had to wear them when they were working behind the counter and not outside. Patricia had said it was probably corporate policy, that sometimes you had to do things you didn't like, because that was part of having a job and being responsible. Jennifer had accepted this with the resignation of someone who understands an argument is pointless, even if you're right. She grabbed her car keys, told her mother she'd see her later, drove to the Dairy Queen. The drive took 12 minutes in afternoon traffic. She clocked in at 4:07 in the afternoon, 3 minutes before her shift officially started, because Jennifer was chronically early to everything, couldn't stand the idea of being late, of making people wait for her. Her shift was unremarkable. The manager, a man named Tom Daniels, would tell police that Jennifer seemed normal, happy even, joking with customers, singing along to the radio they kept in the back. It was a Saturday evening in February, which meant they were moderately busy but not slammed. Families coming in for treats after dinner. Teenagers hanging out because there wasn't much else to do in Thornton on a Saturday night in 1987. Jennifer took orders and made blizzards and soft-serve cones and smiled at children who pressed their faces against the glass counter, trying to see all the toppings. She was good with kids, patient with the ones who took forever to decide what they wanted, kind to the ones who were too shy to speak up. Tom noticed this about her, thought she'd be great at whatever she ended up doing, thought whoever hired her in the future would be lucky to have her. Jennifer worked alongside two other employees that evening, Sarah Chen and Miguel Rodriguez, both juniors at Thornton High School. They chatted between customers about school gossip, about which teachers were giving the most homework, about the basketball game that had happened the night before. Normal work conversation. Nothing memorable. Nothing that suggested this shift was different from any other shift Jennifer had worked. At 9:27, she clocked out. 3 minutes early again. But Tom didn't mind, because the store was empty, and Jennifer had finished all her closing tasks, had wiped down the counters and restocked the napkins and done everything on the checklist. He thanked her for her work. She smiled and said, "See you Monday," because she was scheduled for another shift after school on Monday. Sarah and Miguel were still there, closing down the store, counting the register, mopping the floors. Jennifer waved goodbye. She walked across the parking lot to her Malibu. The security camera above the back door captured her getting into her car at 9:29. The camera was primarily positioned to monitor the store's rear entrance, where deliveries were made and employees came and went. It caught Jennifer in profile, her blonde hair visible under the parking lot lights, her red Dairy Queen polo bright against the darkness. She opened the driver's door, slid inside, closed the door behind her. The camera's range ended at the parking lot's edge. Jennifer backed out of her space. She turned left onto 88th Avenue, heading west toward home. Somewhere in the next 15 minutes, in the ordinary darkness of a February evening in suburban Denver, Jennifer Holbrook's life ended. She never made it home. She never walked through the front door. She never told her mother about her day. By 10:15, Patricia Holbrook was worried. By 10:30, she was calling Jennifer's friends. By 11, she was calling the police. The initial response was frustrating, in the way that missing person cases often are when the missing person is 17 and has only been gone for 2 hours. The officer who took Patricia's call was polite, but not alarmed. Officer Kenneth Murray, who had been with Thornton Police Department for 6 years, who had taken hundreds of similar calls that had all resolved harmlessly. Teenagers stayed out late. Teenagers went to parties. Teenagers forgot to call home. Teenagers got caught up with friends or boyfriends and lost track of time. In Murray's experience, 95% of missing teenager calls resulted in the teenager showing up within 12 hours, usually embarrassed, usually with a perfectly reasonable explanation for why they hadn't called. He'd learned not to overreact to worried parents, had learned that treating every late teenager as an emergency wasted resources and created unnecessary panic. Patricia insisted that Jennifer wasn't like that Jennifer always called, that something was wrong. She explained that Jennifer had left work at 9:30, that the drive home took 15 minutes, that it was now 10:45, and Jennifer hadn't arrived and hadn't called and wasn't answering her car phone, the bulky mobile phone that Robert had installed in Jennifer's car, specifically so she could call if she ever had car trouble or needed help. Patricia had been calling that number every 5 minutes for the past hour. It rang and rang without answer. Murray listened to Patricia's concerns with professional patience. He took down the information: Jennifer's full name, her date of birth, her physical description, her vehicle description, and license plate number. He asked if Jennifer had a boyfriend, if there had been any arguments at home, if Jennifer had seemed upset or troubled recently. Patricia said no to all of these. Jennifer was happy. Jennifer was responsible. Jennifer didn't go to parties. Jennifer didn't drink or do drugs. Jennifer was a good kid who followed rules and called when she was going to be late. Murray filed a report. He said they'd keep an eye out. He said if Jennifer didn't come home by morning, Patricia should call back and they'd escalate the response. He said she should try not to worry, that Jennifer would probably come home soon with an explanation. Patricia wanted to believe him. Some part of her wanted to accept that she was overreacting, that Jennifer had simply gone to a friend's house and would be apologetic when she got home. But a deeper instinct, the kind of instinct mothers have, told her something was wrong. She could feel it, a cold certainty settling in her chest, a knowledge that this was not a case of Jennifer forgetting to call. Patricia Holbrook did not sleep that night. She sat in Jennifer's room, surrounded by those ceramic horses arranged on their shelf, surrounded by Jennifer's posters and books, and the accumulated evidence of 17 years of life. She sat in Jennifer's desk chair and stared at the empty driveway visible through Jennifer's window, waiting for the sound of the Malibu's engine, waiting for headlights to sweep across the front of the house, waiting for Jennifer to walk through the door. Her husband, Robert, drove the route between Dairy Queen and their house 6 times between 11 that night and 3 in the morning, peering into ditches, scanning parking lots, looking for that powder blue car. Each time he saw a car on the side of the road, his heart would seize and he'd pull over to check. Each time it was the wrong car or no car at all, just shadows playing tricks in the darkness. He stopped at gas stations and convenience stores, asking if anyone had seen a blonde teenage girl, if anyone had noticed a blue Malibu. No one had. He drove past the homes of Jennifer's friends, looking for her car in their driveways, considering waking them to ask if they'd seen her, but not wanting to create panic if this was somehow a misunderstanding. He drove past the high school, past the shopping centers, past every place Jennifer might conceivably have stopped. He found nothing. By dawn, he was exhausted and terrified, his hands shaking on the steering wheel, his mind cycling through increasingly horrific possibilities he tried desperately to suppress. Dawn came. Jennifer did not. Patricia called the police again at 6 in the morning, 8 hours after Jennifer had left work. This time, the response was different. The officer who answered asked Patricia to come to the station immediately, to bring a recent photograph of Jennifer, to bring any information about what Jennifer had been wearing, where she'd been, who she might have been with. By 8 in the morning on February 8th, the police response had changed. This was no longer a teenager out late. This was something else. This was what everyone feared it might be. Thornton Police Department began a formal missing person investigation. They contacted Jennifer's friends, waking them with phone calls that frightened them, asking when they'd last seen Jennifer, if she'd mentioned plans, if she'd seemed upset about anything. They contacted the Dairy Queen, spoke with Tom Daniels and Sarah and Miguel, verified that Jennifer had left at 9:30. They obtained the security camera footage showing Jennifer getting into her car. They put out a bulletin to all law enforcement agencies in the Denver metro area, describing Jennifer and her vehicle, asking officers to watch for either. They found Jennifer's car first. A highway patrol officer spotted it around noon on February 8th, parked on the shoulder of Highway 36, about 12 miles northwest of the Dairy Queen, in the opposite direction from Jennifer's house. Officer David Blackwell had been patrolling the highway when he noticed the Malibu, powder blue with a Visualize World Peace bumper sticker, matching the description in the bulletin he'd received that morning. The car was locked. The keys were gone. Blackwell called it in, then waited with the vehicle until detectives arrived. When they opened the car, using tools to bypass the lock without damaging it in case there was evidence on the door itself. They found Jennifer's backpack on the passenger seat, her Dairy Queen visor on the dashboard, a Madonna tape half ejected from the deck. The tape was True Blue, the album Jennifer had bought with her first Dairy Queen paycheck. The tape was stopped in the middle of Papa Don't Preach, Jennifer's favorite song from that album. There was no sign of a struggle. There were no bloodstains. There was no obvious evidence of what had happened. The car's position made no sense. Jennifer had no reason to be on Highway 36. She had no reason to be heading northwest. The road there was largely undeveloped in 1987. Farmland and scattered houses, areas where streetlights gave way to long stretches of darkness. Police impounded the car. They began processing it for fingerprints, for fibers, for any trace evidence that might explain how Jennifer's car had ended up 12 miles from where it should have been. The forensics team worked carefully, methodically, photographing every surface, dusting every possible touch point. They found dozens of fingerprints, as expected, in a car that belonged to a teenager who often had friends riding with her. Most of the prints were Jennifer's own, found on the steering wheel, the gear shift, the door handles. They found prints belonging to Patricia and Robert Holbrook, found prints belonging to Amanda Reeves, found prints that would eventually be matched to other friends and family members who had ridden in the car at various times. They found 3 sets of prints that couldn't be immediately identified, but unidentified prints in a car weren't necessarily significant. They could have been from the previous owner, from mechanics who'd worked on the car, from gas station attendants who'd pumped gas back when full service was still common. They found no obvious signs of a struggle inside the vehicle, no torn upholstery, no items knocked to the floor, nothing to suggest Jennifer had fought with someone in the car. But they found something subtle that made the lead detective, a man named Frank Morrison, pause and look more closely. The driver's seat was pushed significantly further back than would have been comfortable for Jennifer, who was 5'4" and typically drove with the seat positioned closer to the pedals. Someone taller had moved that seat, had driven the car after Jennifer. The rear-view mirror was also adjusted at an angle that wouldn't have given Jennifer a proper view. Small details, but significant. They suggested that after Jennifer left the Dairy Queen parking lot, someone else had driven her car, someone taller and possibly male, someone who had adjusted the driver's position to fit themselves. This person had driven the car to Highway 36 and abandoned it there. Where was Jennifer when this happened? Had she been in the car, forced into the passenger seat, or the back? Had she already been taken somewhere else? The car ditched as a way to mislead investigators? The discovery of the car escalated the investigation into high gear. This was no longer a missing teenager who might have run away or gotten lost. This was an abduction, a crime in progress, a race against time to find Jennifer before something worse happened, though many of the investigators already suspected the worst had happened. You don't generally abduct someone and keep them alive for long. Statistics said if Jennifer was still alive, she likely wouldn't be for much longer. Morrison assembled a team of 30 officers and detectives. They began searching the area around where the car was found, spreading out in a grid pattern, walking through fields and along the highway shoulder, looking for any sign of Jennifer or evidence of what had happened to her. They searched through the afternoon and into the evening, using flashlights as darkness fell, determined not to miss anything. They found tire tracks that might or might not have been related to Jennifer's car. They found fast food wrappers and beer cans and all the ordinary detritus of a highway shoulder. They found no sign of Jennifer. They found Jennifer's body the next day, February 9th, 1987. A rancher named William Patterson, no relation to Derek Patterson, checking his fence line along a drainage ditch about 2 miles from where the car had been found, discovered her. He'd been walking his property line, looking for breaks in the fencing where cattle might escape, when he saw something in the ditch that didn't look right. At first, he thought it was debris, trash dumped illegally. People sometimes threw all kinds of things into ditches on rural properties. But as he got closer, he realized it was a person, a young woman, lying face down in partially frozen water. Patterson was 73 years old, had lived his entire life on this land, had seen cattle die and horses break legs and all the hardships that come with ranching, but he'd never seen anything like this. He ran back to his house, called the police, then returned to the ditch because he couldn't stand the thought of leaving her there alone, couldn't stand the thought of her lying in the water without anyone nearby, even though he knew she was dead, could tell from 20 feet away that she was dead. When Morrison arrived at the scene, his heart sank. The body was clearly Jennifer Holbrook, blonde hair matted with mud and ice, wearing the pink sweater her mother had described, wearing acid-washed jeans and white sneakers. She was lying face down in partially frozen water, her arms positioned above her head as though she'd been reaching for something or trying to pull herself forward. The water in the ditch was only about 6 inches deep, not enough to drown in under normal circumstances, but Jennifer had not been in normal circumstances. Morrison called for the coroner, for the forensics team, for everyone who would be needed to properly process the scene. Then he stood there in the cold February morning, looking at this girl who'd been alive 48 hours earlier, who'd been making blizzards and thinking about prom, who'd had her whole life ahead of her until someone decided to take it away. The coroner, Dr. Helen Yamamoto, arrived within an hour. She examined Jennifer's body where it lay, not wanting to move her until photographs had been taken from every angle, until measurements had been recorded, until the scene had been documented as thoroughly as possible. Yamamoto had been a medical examiner for 15 years, had performed hundreds of autopsies, had seen bodies in every imaginable state of trauma and decay. But child victims, and 17 was still a child in Yamamoto's mind, were always the hardest. She forced herself to remain clinical, to observe details without allowing emotion to interfere with her work. Jennifer's body showed obvious signs of violent assault. There was severe bruising around her throat, the kind of bruising that indicated manual strangulation, someone's hands squeezing with enough force to collapse her trachea. The bruising pattern suggested the attacker had been facing Jennifer, had looked at her while killing her. There were defensive wounds on Jennifer's forearms and hands, scratches and bruises that indicated she'd fought, that she'd tried to push her attacker away or protect herself. Her fingernails were broken, and there appeared to be biological material under the nails, skin cells or blood from her attacker. Jennifer's clothing was torn in several places. Her jeans had been pulled down and were tangled around her ankles. Her underwear was missing. These details told a story Yamamoto had seen too many times before. Jennifer had been sexually assaulted before being killed. The exact sequence of events would become clearer during the autopsy, but the evidence at the scene was already painting a horrific picture. Someone had attacked Jennifer, had assaulted her, had strangled her, and had left her to die in this ditch. The water in the ditch was partially frozen, ice forming along the edges, but the center where Jennifer lay had been liquid, kept from freezing by moving water from recent snowmelt. Yamamoto determined that Jennifer had been alive when she entered the water, that she had breathed in water while being strangled, that she had died from a combination of strangulation and drowning. It would have been terrifying and painful and drawn out longer than if strangulation alone had killed her. She had fought until she couldn't fight anymore, had struggled until her body failed, and then she had died alone in 6 inches of frozen water while her killer disappeared into the night. The autopsy provided more details, but no immediate answers about who had killed Jennifer. Yamamoto determined that Jennifer had died between 9:45 and 11 on the night of February 7th, within hours of leaving work. The sexual assault had occurred shortly before her death. Jennifer had been a virgin prior to the assault, which added another layer of tragedy to an already unspeakable crime. Someone had taken not just her life, but her first sexual experience, had made what should have been something Jennifer chose for herself into an act of violence and terror. Yamamoto collected evidence from Jennifer's body with meticulous care. She took swabs from every relevant area, collecting semen that the attacker had left behind. She carefully scraped under Jennifer's fingernails, preserving the skin cells she'd collected while fighting for her life. She photographed every bruise, every mark, every injury. She measured and documented and catalogued, creating a record that might eventually help identify Jennifer's killer. But in 1987, the technology to turn that evidence into an identity didn't exist yet. All Yamamoto could do was preserve it and hope that someday science would catch up with justice. The investigation that followed was extensive and ultimately fruitless. Adams County Sheriff's Department devoted enormous resources to Jennifer's case. They understood that the first 48 hours after a murder are critical, that if you don't develop solid leads quickly, cases become exponentially harder to solve. They interviewed hundreds of people. Every student at Thornton High School who knew Jennifer, every teacher, every Dairy Queen customer who had been there that night, every employee who'd worked with Jennifer or who'd been in the store during her shift. They talked to Derek Patterson, who had been at home that night with his parents and 3 siblings, whose alibi was airtight and who broke down crying when they told him Jennifer had been murdered. They talked to Jennifer's ex-boyfriend from sophomore year, a boy named Michael Chen, who had moved to Arizona 6 months earlier and who had phone records proving he'd been in Phoenix the night Jennifer died. They talked to Tom Daniels, the Dairy Queen manager, who had stayed at the store until 11 that night doing paperwork, who had been seen by multiple employees, whose timeline left no window for him to have followed Jennifer. They expanded their scope beyond Jennifer's immediate circle. They looked at sex offenders in the area, pulling records for every registered offender within a 50-mile radius of Thornton. In 1987, sex offender registries were less comprehensive than they would later become, but there were still men on the books who'd been convicted of rape or sexual assault. Detectives visited each one, asked about their whereabouts on February 7th, looked for any indication that they might have been involved. Most had alibis. Some didn't, but also didn't seem like viable suspects for various reasons related to age, physical capability, or lack of access to the area where Jennifer disappeared. They looked at unsolved assaults with similar patterns, checking with other jurisdictions to see if there had been other attacks that matched Jennifer's case. They found a few cases that had surface similarities, women attacked in parking lots or grabbed off streets, but none that seemed clearly connected. The attacks had different methods, different locations, different victim profiles. They canvassed the area where Jennifer's car was found and where her body was discovered. They knocked on doors at every house within a 5-mile radius, asking if anyone had seen anything unusual on the night of February 7th. Had anyone noticed a powder blue Malibu driving past? Had anyone seen any vehicles parked on the shoulder of Highway 36? Had anyone heard anything that might have been Jennifer screaming or fighting? The area was sparsely populated, homes spread out across farmland, and most residents had been inside on that cold February night, not looking out windows, not paying attention to the highway. No one had seen anything useful. No one had heard anything. Jennifer had been murdered in an area isolated enough that her screams, if she'd been able to scream, wouldn't have reached anyone who could help. They developed theories. The prevailing one was that Jennifer had been forced off the road or had stopped to help someone who appeared to need assistance. Perhaps someone had flagged her down, had pretended to have car trouble, had used the universal distress signal of a car on the shoulder, with hood up to lure a good Samaritan. Jennifer was known to be kind, helpful, the sort of person who would stop for someone in need. Her friends and family all agreed she would absolutely stop if she thought someone needed help. Amanda Reeves told detectives about a time when Jennifer had stopped to help an elderly woman change a flat tire, had gotten her hands dirty and greasy, and been late to work because she wouldn't leave until she was sure the woman could drive safely. That was who Jennifer was. She would have stopped. The location of her car suggested she'd driven northwest on 88th Avenue instead of west toward home, perhaps following someone who'd asked for help, perhaps forced to follow someone at gunpoint or knife point. But why? By whom? They had no witnesses. No one had seen Jennifer after she left the Dairy Queen parking lot, not counting that brief glimpse on the security camera. The highway where her car was found was lightly traveled at that time of night. The area where her body was discovered was isolated enough that someone could commit murder without being observed. The killer had been careful or lucky or both. They had left behind biological evidence, but in an era when that evidence couldn't yet speak. The physical evidence they did have seemed to lead nowhere. The unidentified fingerprints in Jennifer's car didn't match anyone in the criminal database. The tire tracks near where the car was found were too degraded to provide useful information. The skin cells under Jennifer's fingernails were too small a sample to do much with using 1987 technology. They had evidence, but no way to connect it to a person. Morrison and his team worked the case obsessively through the spring of 1987. They followed every lead, no matter how tenuous. Someone called in saying they'd seen Jennifer at a gas station in Wyoming, and detectives drove to Wyoming to investigate, only to find it was a case of mistaken identity, a different blonde girl who looked nothing like Jennifer when they actually saw her. Someone else called, claiming to have psychic knowledge of who killed Jennifer, and Morrison, desperate enough to grasp at anything, interviewed this person and tried to determine if there was any legitimate information or if it was all vague generalities that could apply to anyone. It was the latter. They received dozens of tips from people claiming to know something, claiming to have seen something, claiming their ex-boyfriend or neighbor or co-worker was acting suspicious and could be the killer. Every tip had to be followed up, every claim investigated. 99% led nowhere. The remaining 1% led to dead ends that looked promising initially, but ultimately revealed nothing useful. By summer, the active investigation was losing momentum. It wasn't that detectives gave up or stopped caring. It was that they'd exhausted every obvious avenue. They'd interviewed everyone they could identify who might have information. They'd searched every location that might be relevant. They'd pursued every lead that had even minimal potential. Now they were out of places to look, out of people to interview, out of ideas for what to try next. The case remained open, officially unsolved, a file that sat on Morrison's desk, mocking him with its incompleteness. He would pull it out periodically, reread witness statements, study crime scene photos, hope that fresh eyes might spot something he'd missed. He never found anything. Jennifer's case haunted him for the rest of his career. When he retired in 1999, he told his replacement about Jennifer, said she was the one that got away, the one he'd never been able to solve, the one he'd failed. He carried guilt about that failure until his death in 2014, even though objectively he'd done everything possible, had devoted thousands of hours to finding Jennifer's killer, had done his absolute best with the tools and technology available to him at the time. Patricia and Robert Holbrook did not let their daughter disappear into statistics. They kept her case alive through sheer force of will. They met with investigators every month, then every few months, then twice a year as the years accumulated and new detectives rotated through the unit. Each new detective assigned to cold cases would review Jennifer's file, would meet with Patricia and Robert, would promise to do everything possible to find answers. Some were more dedicated than others. Some genuinely reviewed the case, looking for overlooked details. Others went through the motions, recognizing that decades-old cases with no new leads were unlikely to suddenly break open. Patricia learned to tell the difference, learned which detectives actually cared, and which were just being professionally courteous. She focused her energy on the ones who cared, maintained relationships with them, stayed in touch even after they rotated to different assignments or retired from the force. They kept Jennifer's room exactly as she'd left it, the ceramic horses still arranged on their shelf, the posters still on the walls, the desk with Jennifer's homework still visible where she'd left it the day before she died, as though preserving the physical space might somehow preserve the momentum of the investigation. Friends and family gently suggested that maybe Patricia should redecorate, that keeping Jennifer's room as a shrine wasn't healthy, that maybe it was time to move forward. Patricia would smile tightly and change the subject. She wasn't ready to move forward. Moving forward meant accepting that Jennifer was really gone, that life would continue without answers, that the world would forget Jennifer had ever existed. She couldn't accept that. She wouldn't. The room stayed untouched, a time capsule from 1987, while the rest of the house aged around it. The carpet in the hallway was replaced, the kitchen was remodeled, the living room furniture was updated. But Jennifer's room remained frozen, the only space in the house where time had stopped. Patricia became an advocate for families of murder victims, joining support groups where she met other parents and siblings and spouses who'd lost loved ones to violence. She found comfort in these groups, found people who understood what she was going through in ways that even well-meaning friends couldn't. Unless you'd experienced the specific horror of having someone you loved murdered, unless you'd lived with the combination of grief and anger and powerlessness that comes with an unsolved homicide, you couldn't fully understand what it felt like. The support groups provided space where Patricia didn't have to explain herself, didn't have to pretend she was doing better than she was, could talk honestly about how much she hated the person who'd killed Jennifer, how she fantasized about what she'd do to him if she ever found him, how some mornings she woke up and forgot for just a moment that Jennifer was dead, and then had to remember all over again, the grief crashing over her like it was brand new. She began lobbying for better resources for cold case investigations, for better training in evidence preservation, for databases that could track and connect unsolved crimes across jurisdictions. She learned to navigate bureaucracy, learned how to schedule meetings with legislators and police administrators, learned how to make her case effectively without letting emotion overwhelm her message. She became surprisingly good at it, this woman who'd been a quiet homemaker before Jennifer's murder, who'd never been politically active or particularly assertive. Grief had given her purpose and focus. She couldn't bring Jennifer back, but she could work to help other families find answers, could push for systemic changes that might prevent other cases from going cold the way Jennifer's had. She testified before legislative committees about the importance of DNA databases. She lobbied for funding for cold case units. She met with police departments to discuss evidence preservation protocols. Some listened and implemented changes. Others were polite but dismissive. She kept pushing regardless. She gave interviews on every anniversary of Jennifer's death, determined that her daughter's name would not be forgotten, that some reporter's attention might shake loose a memory, might prompt someone to come forward, might generate the lead that had eluded police for all these years. She would sit in her living room with news cameras and reporters and tell Jennifer's story one more time. Who Jennifer was, what happened to her, what the family had endured, what they were still hoping for. The interviews got easier over time, in the sense that Patricia could tell the story without breaking down, could maintain composure while discussing her daughter's murder. But they never stopped being painful. Each interview meant reliving that night, remembering the moment she realized Jennifer wasn't coming home, remembering the detective who came to their door on February 9th to tell them they'd found Jennifer's body, remembering the funeral where they'd buried a closed casket because Jennifer's body had been too damaged to view, remembering every moment of the worst period of her life. Robert struggled more quietly. He aged rapidly in those years after Jennifer's murder. Photographs from 1987 show a man in his early 40s with dark hair and a ready smile, someone who looked comfortable in his own skin, someone who laughed easily. Photographs from the early 90s show someone who looks 20 years older, hair gone grey, face etched with lines that hadn't been there before, eyes that held a kind of permanent sadness. He went to work every day, continued his job in construction, functioned adequately, but without the energy and engagement he'd brought to life before Jennifer died. His co-workers noticed the change, tried to be supportive, eventually learned not to mention Jennifer because it visibly pained Robert to talk about her. He attended the support groups with Patricia, but rarely spoke, sat quietly while others shared their experiences, absorbed their stories without contributing his own. He developed health problems that doctors attributed to stress, high blood pressure, insomnia, digestive issues. His body was manifesting what his mind tried to contain, the chronic stress of unresolved grief taking physical toll. He took medications, tried to manage his symptoms, continued functioning, because what else could he do? He and Patricia rarely talked about Jennifer between themselves, not because they'd forgotten or stopped caring, but because talking about it hurt too much, opened wounds that never quite healed, brought up emotions they couldn't afford to feel if they wanted to get through the day. They existed in parallel grief, each suffering privately, supporting each other through presence rather than words. Their marriage survived, which many marriages don't after a child's murder, but it was transformed, became something quieter and sadder than it had been when both their daughters were alive, and their biggest concerns were about report cards and college applications. Robert died in 2003, 16 years after his daughter. Heart attack at 59, too young, his body giving out under the accumulated stress of nearly 2 decades of grief. Patricia would say later that he died of a broken heart, that the not knowing had killed him as surely as any disease. He'd never learned who murdered Jennifer. He'd never been able to look that person in the eye, to demand answers, to achieve any sense of closure or justice. He'd carried questions for 16 years with no possibility of answers, and eventually his body had decided it was done, carrying anything at all. Patricia buried him next to Jennifer in Crown Hill Cemetery, side by side under matching grey headstones, father and daughter reunited in death, though Robert had always hoped to be reunited with Jennifer in solved justice rather than burial plots. His death hit Patricia harder than she'd expected, even though she'd watched him deteriorate for years. She'd lost her daughter, and now she'd lost her husband, and she was alone in a house that felt too big, too empty, too full of memories she couldn't escape. The case file remained open but inactive. In law enforcement, there's a rhythm to investigations, an initial surge of activity that gradually diminishes if no breaks appear. Jennifer's case followed that pattern. By 1990, the active investigation had essentially stopped. Detectives weren't ignoring the case, weren't forgetting about Jennifer, but they also weren't actively working her murder because there was nothing left to actively work. They'd pursued every lead they had. They'd interviewed everyone they could find. They'd searched every location that might yield evidence. Now they were waiting, hoping someone would come forward with new information, hoping forensic science would advance enough to make use of the evidence they'd preserved. The file sat in a box in the evidence room, labeled Holbrook, Jennifer, Homicide, 1987, surrounded by dozens of other boxes containing other unsolved cases from other years. Jennifer had company in that evidence room, though it was cold comfort. All those boxes represented all those families still waiting for answers, still hoping that someday justice would find its way home. New detectives would occasionally pull Jennifer's file, review it, hope to spot something their predecessors had missed. This was standard practice in cold case units, the idea being that fresh eyes might notice details that had become invisible through familiarity, might make connections that earlier investigators had overlooked. Detective Lisa Chen reviewed Jennifer's case in 1995 when she was assigned to the cold case unit. She spent 3 weeks reading every document in the file, studying every photograph, tracing the investigation's path from beginning to current stasis. She found nothing new. The investigation had been thorough. Every reasonable avenue had been explored. The evidence that existed was insufficient to identify a suspect without technological advances that didn't yet exist. Chen put the file back in its box, feeling frustrated and helpless, understanding why this case had haunted Morrison for his entire career. It was solvable theoretically, the evidence existed to identify the killer, but practically it remained out of reach, a puzzle missing the final piece that would make everything clear. They never did. The evidence collected from Jennifer's body and clothing sat in storage, carefully preserved according to protocol, but functionally useless without the technology to analyze it properly. The biological samples were stored in a temperature-controlled evidence facility, kept frozen to prevent degradation, labeled and catalogued so they could be located if needed. Detectives knew the samples were there, knew they potentially held Jennifer's killer's identity, but they had no way to extract that information using 1980s technology. DNA analysis existed, was being used in cutting-edge forensic laboratories, but it was expensive and time-consuming and required relatively large samples and wasn't yet standard practice in local investigations. Adams County Sheriff's Department, like most local law enforcement agencies, didn't have the budget or expertise to routinely conduct DNA analysis. They preserved the evidence and waited, hoping that eventually the technology would become accessible and affordable enough to apply to Jennifer's case. In 1995, when DNA analysis began to be more widely used in criminal investigations, Adams County Sheriff's Department conducted a review of cold cases to determine which might benefit from this new technology. Jennifer's case was at the top of the list. They had good biological evidence from her body, samples that had been carefully preserved, evidence that should be sufficient to develop a DNA profile if the lab could extract and analyze it successfully. They submitted the evidence for DNA analysis, sending it to the Colorado Bureau of Investigation's Forensic Laboratory. The lab was backlogged with cases, as all crime labs were during that period, when DNA analysis was new, and every jurisdiction was submitting old evidence, hoping to solve cold cases. Jennifer's samples sat in queue for 8 months before an analyst finally processed them. The lab was able to develop a profile, a genetic fingerprint of Jennifer's killer. It was a significant development. It meant that if they ever found a suspect, they could definitively prove or eliminate him through DNA comparison. The profile showed that Jennifer's killer was male, which wasn't surprising given the nature of the assault. It showed certain genetic markers that would be unique to this individual or potentially shared by close relatives. But a DNA profile without a suspect to compare it to is like having a key without knowing which door it opens. They had information, but no one to use it on. Still, it was progress. 8 years after Jennifer's murder, they finally had something concrete beyond witness statements and physical evidence that couldn't speak. They had science on their side now, even if that science couldn't yet tell them who they were looking for. They entered the profile into CODIS, the FBI's combined DNA index system, which was just beginning to be implemented nationally in the mid-1990s. CODIS was designed to compare DNA evidence from crime scenes against DNA profiles of convicted offenders and arrestees, creating a searchable database that could link crimes across jurisdictions and identify perpetrators even if they'd never been suspects in the specific case where their DNA was found. It was revolutionary technology, the kind of tool that would transform cold case investigations. But in 1995, it was still in its infancy. The database was small, containing profiles from only a fraction of convicted offenders because states were just beginning to pass laws requiring DNA collection from criminals. Jennifer's killer's profile went into CODIS and was compared against every profile in the system. No matches came back. The killer, whoever he was, had never been arrested for a crime serious enough to require DNA submission, or he had committed Jennifer's murder before widespread DNA collection began, and had been careful enough since then to avoid arrest for anything that would trigger DNA testing. The profile sat in the database, waiting, a string of genetic markers that held a name if only someone could decode it. Years passed. The database grew as more states implemented DNA collection laws, as more offenders were swabbed and their profiles entered into the system. Jennifer's killer's profile was automatically compared against new entries, the system running comparisons in the background, checking for matches that might finally identify who had murdered a 17-year-old girl on a February night in 1987. Still no matches came back. Detectives checked periodically, hoping to see that a match had been found, that the system had finally identified Jennifer's killer. They were always disappointed. The profile remained unique, matched no one in the database, told them nothing except that Jennifer's killer had somehow avoided being arrested for anything serious enough to require DNA submission. By the mid-2000s, Jennifer Holbrook's case had become what detectives call a true cold case, unsolved for so long that everyone involved in the original investigation had retired or moved on. Frank Morrison had retired. Lisa Chen had been promoted and transferred to another unit. The Dairy Queen where Jennifer worked had been torn down and replaced with a shopping center. The high school had been renovated. The neighborhood where Jennifer had lived had changed. Old families moving away, new families moving in, people with no memory of the girl who'd been murdered there. The case file had been digitized, entered into computer systems that didn't exist in 1987. The physical documents scanned and saved as PDFs that could be accessed from any computer in the department. The evidence remained in storage, boxes containing Jennifer's clothing, the swabs from her body, photographs and reports, and all the accumulated material of an unsolved homicide. Patricia Holbrook still called the sheriff's department periodically, still asked if there was any news, still maintained her vigil. The answer was always the same. No new leads. The case remains open. We haven't forgotten Jennifer. By 2010, it had been 23 years since Jennifer's murder. Patricia Holbrook was 68 years old. She had spent more than a third of her life waiting for answers. She had buried her husband, raised Jennifer's younger sister Amy, who had been only 11 when Jennifer died, watched that sister graduate college and get married and have children Jennifer would never meet. Amy had named her first daughter Jennifer, determined that her niece would know her aunt's name even if she never got to meet her. Patricia was a grandmother now, though the joy of grandchildren was always tinged with sadness, with awareness that Jennifer would never be a mother, would never hold children of her own. She maintained Jennifer's room for decades, but eventually she packed up the ceramic horses, donated the clothes, repainted the walls. It felt like betrayal, like she was erasing Jennifer, but she couldn't sustain the shrine forever. The room became a guest room, though Patricia rarely had guests. It was too painful, she said, to watch people sleep in Jennifer's bed, to see the room used for its intended purpose when Jennifer should have been the one using it. She kept Jennifer's memory alive in other ways. Photographs throughout the house, a memorial garden in the backyard with a stone bench and Jennifer's favorite flowers, irises that bloomed every spring in shades of purple and yellow, the annual interviews on the anniversary of Jennifer's death, the advocacy work that had become Patricia's second career, her way of finding meaning in meaningless tragedy. The community had largely moved on. Thornton High School had been renovated twice since Jennifer's graduation year. The Dairy Queen where Jennifer worked had been torn down and replaced with a shopping center. The highway where her body was found had been widened and improved, drainage ditches covered or redirected, the landscape transformed enough that Patricia wasn't even sure anymore exactly where Jennifer had lain. New residents moved into the neighborhood, with no knowledge of the girl who had once been murdered on a February night. The story faded from collective memory, remembered primarily by Patricia and by a few dedicated detectives who periodically reviewed the case file, hoping for that elusive break. Time has that effect, eroding even the most painful memories, moving people forward whether they want to move or not. Patricia resented it sometimes, resented that the world had forgotten Jennifer, while she remained trapped in eternal grief. But she also understood it. People can't maintain active mourning for decades. Life demands forward momentum. Only those directly affected have the luxury or curse of remaining frozen in the moment of loss. The break came from genealogy, of all things, from people researching their family trees, from the explosion of consumer DNA testing, from databases like GEDmatch that allowed users to upload their genetic profiles to search for relatives. It came from a technique called genetic genealogy, which had been used successfully in 2018 to identify the Golden State Killer after 40 years. The Golden State Killer case had been a sensation, a serial killer who'd terrorized California in the 1970s and 80s, finally identified through DNA comparison with relatives who'd voluntarily submitted their profiles to genealogy websites. The killer himself had never been in CODIS, had never been arrested for anything that required DNA submission, so traditional database comparison had failed to identify him. But his third cousins were in GEDmatch, and genealogists working with law enforcement had built family trees backward from those cousins, identifying the common ancestors they shared with the Golden State Killer, then forward through generations until they narrowed the possibilities to a single suspect. The technique was revolutionary and controversial. Privacy advocates raised concerns about using genetic data that people had submitted for genealogical purposes for law enforcement investigations. They argued that people who uploaded their DNA to find ancestors or learn about their heritage hadn't consented to helping police investigate their relatives. But victims' families and law enforcement argued that solving murders and rapes was a legitimate use of the technology, that privacy concerns couldn't outweigh justice for violent crimes, that anyone who didn't want their DNA used for law enforcement purposes simply shouldn't upload it to public databases. The debate continued while more cases were solved using the technique. By 2023, genetic genealogy had been used to identify suspects in over 200 cold cases, bringing resolution to families who'd waited decades for answers. In early 2023, Adams County Sheriff's Department partnered with a genetic genealogy firm called Parabon Nanolabs to review several cold cases that had viable DNA evidence but no matches in CODIS. Jennifer Holbrook's case was at the top of the list, both because of its age and because the evidence quality was excellent. The semen sample collected from Jennifer's body had been well preserved, sufficient to generate a comprehensive DNA profile. The department paid Parabon a substantial fee to conduct the genetic genealogy investigation, money that came from a state grant specifically designated for cold case investigations. In March 2023, a genealogist named Rebecca Morrison, no relation to the original detective, was assigned to Jennifer's case. She'd been working in genetic genealogy for 5 years, had helped solve 17 cases in that time, had become skilled at the painstaking work of building family trees from DNA matches. In March 2023, Morrison uploaded the killer's DNA profile to GEDmatch. The profile was entered as a Jane Doe case, identified only by a case number, protecting the investigation's details while allowing comparison against the database. Within days, she had multiple hits, people who shared DNA with the profile at levels suggesting they were relatives. The closest match was a woman who shared approximately 500 centimorgans of DNA with the killer, indicating she was likely a second cousin. Other matches ranged from potential second cousins to third cousins and beyond. Morrison began building family trees, working backward from these matches to identify common ancestors. Genetic genealogy is detective work and traditional genealogy combined, requiring both scientific understanding of DNA inheritance patterns and research skills to trace families through census records, birth certificates, marriage licenses, death certificates, and all the documented evidence of human lives across generations. She began building family trees, working backward from these matches to identify common ancestors. The woman who was the closest match had uploaded her profile with her real name attached, which made Morrison's job easier. Her name was Carol Henderson, and she'd submitted her DNA to learn more about her maternal grandmother's ancestry. Morrison contacted Henderson through GED Match's messaging system, explaining that she was a genetic genealogist working with law enforcement on a cold case investigation, asking if Henderson would be willing to share information about her family tree. Henderson agreed immediately. She said if her DNA could help solve a crime, she wanted to help. Morrison asked Henderson about her ancestors, particularly about her great-grandparents on her father's side, the line where the shared DNA with the killer appeared to originate. Henderson provided names and dates and locations, information that allowed Morrison to begin constructing a comprehensive family tree. Henderson's great-grandfather was a man named William Keller, who'd been born in Colorado in 1895, who'd married a woman named Martha Schmidt in 1918, who'd had 7 children between 1919 and 1933. Those 7 children were Henderson's grandfather and his siblings, which meant they were also the killer's relatives at some remove. Morrison needed to trace those lines forward to identify all the descendants of William and Martha Keller, to narrow the possibilities to men who would have been the right age in 1987, who would have been in the Denver area when Jennifer was murdered. By May, she had narrowed the possibilities to 3 family lines, descendants of 3 of William and Martha's 7 children. By June, she had identified 7 men who fit the parameters, the right age to have been adults in 1987, living in or near the Denver area at that time, descended from William and Martha Keller. By July, she had narrowed it to 3 viable suspects through a combination of genealogical research and basic investigation of each man's life circumstances. One had died in 1994, which didn't eliminate him as a suspect, but complicated matters since they couldn't obtain a fresh DNA sample for comparison. One had moved to Florida in 1985 and had documented proof he was there in February 1987, employment records and utility bills that confirmed he hadn't been in Colorado when Jennifer was murdered. The third was a man named Robert Keller, William and Martha's great-grandson through their son James. Morrison sent her findings to the Adams County Sheriff's Department, recommending they focus their investigation on Robert Keller as the most viable suspect. She explained the genetic connection, showed them the family tree she'd constructed, outlined why the other potential suspects had been eliminated. Detectives received Morrison's report with a mixture of excitement and caution. They had a name, finally, after 36 years, but a genetic genealogy lead wasn't the same as definitive proof. They needed to confirm that Robert Keller's DNA matched the profile from Jennifer's case before they could consider arresting him. Robert Keller was 71 years old in 2023. He had lived in Denver his entire life, had grown up in Thornton, had graduated from Thornton High School in 1970, 17 years before Jennifer did. In February 1987, he had been 34 years old, married, working as a maintenance supervisor for Denver Public Schools. He had 3 children, ages 6, 8, and 10 at the time of Jennifer's murder. He had no criminal record, no arrests, no convictions, not even a speeding ticket that anyone could find. His life on paper looked completely ordinary, unremarkable in every way except for the apparent genetic connection to a brutal murder. Detectives pulled his file from the original investigation because everyone who worked within a certain radius of the Dairy Queen had been interviewed in 1987. everyone whose job put them on the roads in that area at night. They found a brief interview summary dated February 16, 1987. Detective Frank Morrison had interviewed Robert Keller as part of the broad canvass of potential witnesses. Keller had been cooperative and polite, according to Morrison's notes. He worked for Denver Public Schools as a maintenance supervisor, which meant he sometimes drove between facilities in the evening doing inspections or responding to emergency maintenance calls. On February 7, 1987, Keller had told Morrison he'd been at home with his wife and children all evening, hadn't gone out after getting home from work around 5:30, had no information about Jennifer Holbrook or anyone who might have harmed her. His wife, Sharon Keller, had confirmed his alibi when Morrison followed up with her. She said Robert had been home all evening, had helped put the kids to bed, had watched television with her until they went to sleep around 11. Morrison had noted the interview and moved on because Keller had no obvious connection to Jennifer, no motive, no suspicious history, and an alibi provided by his wife. Reading the interview summary 36 years later, detectives understood that the alibi had been worthless. Spouses lie for each other routinely, especially when the alternative is believing your husband is a murderer. Sharon Keller might have genuinely believed Robert was home all evening, might have not paid close enough attention to notice if he'd left for an hour or two, or she might have known something was wrong and chosen to protect him. They'd never know, because Sharon Keller had died in 2016 from cancer, taking whatever she'd known or suspected to her grave. But the interview confirmed that Robert Keller had been in the area in 1987, had been the right age, had been employed in a job that gave him reason to drive around the Denver area at night. The genetic genealogy had given them a name, and the name fit the parameters of who they were looking for. The genetic genealogy gave investigators something they'd never had before, a specific person to investigate. But a family tree connection isn't enough for an arrest. They needed confirmation. They needed to obtain Robert Keller's DNA in a way that would be admissible in court and compare it directly to the DNA from Jennifer's case. They couldn't simply knock on Keller's door and ask him to submit a sample. If he refused, they'd have no recourse, unless they had probable cause for a warrant, and the genetic genealogy alone might not be sufficient to convince a judge to order DNA collection. Even if a judge did grant a warrant, they risked alerting Keller before they had definitive proof, giving him time to flee or destroy evidence if any still existed. The standard approach in these situations was surveillance and collection of abandoned DNA, legally obtained samples that suspects discarded in public places where they had no reasonable expectation of privacy. They began surveillance in September 2023. Detectives followed Keller as he went about his daily routine, documenting his movements, looking for opportunities to collect DNA he might discard. Keller was retired now, living on a pension from Denver Public Schools and Social Security. He lived alone in the same house on Alameda Avenue he'd lived in since 1982, the house where he'd been living when he murdered Jennifer Holbrook. His wife had died in 2016. His children were grown, had families of their own, visited occasionally, but not frequently, according to the surveillance reports. Keller's life appeared quiet and routine. He woke early, usually around 6. He made coffee and read the newspaper. He watched television. He volunteered at his church, Faith Community Church on Federal Boulevard, helping with maintenance and setup for services. He had coffee most mornings at a diner near his house, the Bluebird Cafe, where he apparently was a regular because the waitstaff knew him by name. He seemed, by all appearances, to be exactly what he claimed to be, an ordinary elderly man living an ordinary life. Detectives watched him help an elderly neighbor carry groceries. They watched him attend church services, sitting in the same pew every week. They watched him have conversations with other regular customers at the Bluebird Cafe, talking about weather and sports and all the inconsequential topics that fill casual conversation. Nothing in his behavior suggested guilt or anxiety. Nothing suggested he was a man who'd murdered a teenager 36 years earlier. This was both unsurprising and deeply unsettling. If Robert Keller was Jennifer's killer, he'd lived with that knowledge for decades, without it obviously affecting his daily life, without it preventing him from going to church or helping neighbors, or presenting himself to the world as a decent person. The cognitive dissonance was difficult for detectives to process. The idea that someone could commit such horrific violence and then just continue living normally, as though the murder had been a brief interruption in an otherwise unremarkable existence. On September 19, 2023, detectives watched Keller have coffee at the Bluebird Cafe. He arrived at 8:15, ordered his usual breakfast, eggs and toast and coffee, sat at the counter reading the Denver Post. He stayed for about 45 minutes, chatting briefly with the waitress, with another regular customer, eating his breakfast, drinking 2 cups of coffee. At 9 o'clock, he paid his check, left a generous tip, and walked out to his car. Detectives waited until his car was out of sight, then entered the cafe. They approached the waitress, showed their badges, asked if she still had the dishes Keller had used. She did, had just placed them in a bus tray to be taken to the kitchen. Detectives retrieved the coffee cup Keller had used, carefully handling it by the bottom to avoid smudging any potential DNA on the rim. They placed it in an evidence bag, labeled it, documented the chain of custody. They took it to the lab. The lab extracted DNA from the saliva on the cup's rim. It wasn't difficult work. Saliva is rich with DNA, cells from the mouth's lining that contain complete genetic profiles. The extraction took a few hours, the comparison to Jennifer's case profile another day, to complete thoroughly and document properly. The match was absolute. The DNA on Robert Keller's coffee cup matched the DNA profile from the semen collected from Jennifer Holbrook's body 36 years earlier. The probability that the DNA on the coffee cup came from anyone other than the person whose DNA was found on Jennifer's body was approximately 1 in 7.8 trillion, odds so astronomical they exceeded the number of humans who'd ever lived on Earth. Robert Keller was Jennifer Holbrook's killer. After 36 years, they had not just a suspect, but definitive proof. The months between confirming the DNA match and making the arrest were consumed by legal preparation and additional investigation. The district attorney's office needed to be involved, needed to review the evidence and determine the appropriate charges, needed to ensure that the arrest and prosecution would be handled properly. They had one chance at this. If they made procedural errors, if they violated Keller's rights in any way, the case could be thrown out despite the DNA evidence. Everyone involved understood the stakes. This was Patricia Holbrook's one chance at justice for Jennifer. This was the culmination of 36 years of waiting and advocacy and hope that had often seemed futile. They couldn't afford to make mistakes. Prosecutors needed to ensure their case was airtight, that every piece of evidence would withstand scrutiny, that the arrest wouldn't be premature or compromised by procedural errors. Investigators dug into Keller's past, looking for any hint of what kind of man could commit such a crime and then live normally for 37 years. They pulled his complete employment history, his financial records, his medical records, with appropriate warrants. They interviewed his children, carefully, without revealing the investigation's true focus. They said they were reviewing old cases and had questions about Robert's work schedule in the 1980s, needed to verify some details for their records. The children were cooperative. They provided what information they could remember about their childhood, about their father's work habits, about their family life. None of them had any idea their father was about to be arrested for murder. Detectives talked to Keller's neighbors, current and former, asking similar vague questions about whether they remembered Robert from the 80s, whether he'd had any unusual behavior, whether they'd noticed anything suspicious. No one had. Detectives talked to people who'd worked with Keller at Denver public schools, tracked down former co-workers who'd retired or moved on to other jobs. Everyone said the same things: quiet, competent, reliable, showed up on time, did his work, didn't cause problems. They talked to people who knew him from church, where Keller had been a member for over 20 years. The pastor described him as devoted and generous, someone who volunteered whenever help was needed, someone who donated money to the building fund, someone who attended services regularly. No one remembered anything suspicious, any inappropriate behavior, any red flags that might have suggested he was capable of violence. If anything, people described Keller in glowing terms, said he was exactly the kind of person churches needed more of, reliable and humble and willing to help. Detectives found this deeply disturbing. They were building a picture of a man who'd successfully compartmentalized his crimes so completely that no one, not even people who knew him well, had ever suspected anything wrong. Keller had maintained a facade of normalcy for 36 years, had been a husband and father, had coached Little League when his kids were young, had organized the church's food drive every Thanksgiving, had helped neighbors with repairs and yard work, had presented himself as a good man, while knowing exactly what he'd done to Jennifer Holbrook. They found no history with Jennifer that anyone could discover. She hadn't attended the schools where Keller worked. There was no evidence they'd ever met before the night he killed her. No mutual friends, no social connections, no reason for their paths to have crossed. Jennifer went to Thornton High School. Keller worked at schools in different areas, primarily elementary and middle schools on the west side of Denver. Jennifer's work schedule at Dairy Queen was irregular, changing week to week based on the manager's scheduling needs. There was no pattern that would have allowed Keller to predict when Jennifer would be driving home from work. It appeared to be an entirely random attack, an opportunistic crime committed by someone who had been in the wrong place at the right time, who had seen a young woman alone at night and had acted on impulses he otherwise kept hidden. This is one of the most disturbing aspects of cases like Jennifer's. The perpetrator wasn't a monster who looked like a monster. He wasn't someone the community had suspected or feared. He was someone they trusted, someone who appeared normal, because in most ways he was normal. Robert Keller had committed one act of horrific violence in an otherwise unremarkable life. He'd gotten up the morning of February 8th, 1987, knowing exactly what he'd done the night before, and he'd gone about his day normally. He'd gone to work. He'd come home to his wife and children. He'd read bedtime stories. He'd lived his life as though he hadn't just murdered a teenage girl and left her body in a ditch. This ability to compartmentalize, to separate different aspects of himself so completely that he could be both a murderer and a family man without cognitive dissonance, was a kind of psychological pathology that experts would later analyze and debate. How could someone do that? How could you kill someone and then just continue living normally? The answer appeared to be that some people simply could, that the capacity for violence could coexist with the appearance of normalcy, that Keller had been able to commit an act of extreme evil and then return to his ordinary life without that act destroying or fundamentally changing him. Psychologists consulted by the prosecution suggested that Keller might have committed other assaults that were never reported or solved. Single victim offenders are relatively rare in cases of stranger sexual assault and murder. More commonly, perpetrators who commit such crimes have histories of escalating behavior, have committed previous assaults or murders that might not have been connected. Detectives searched for other unsolved cases that might match Keller's profile, looked for similar attacks in the Denver area before or after Jennifer's murder. They found several unsolved sexual assaults from the 1980s and early 90s, but none that seemed definitively connected to Keller. DNA from those cases, where it existed, didn't match Keller's profile. It was possible he'd only killed once, that Jennifer had been his only victim. It was also possible he'd committed other crimes that were never reported, that had victims who didn't come forward or cases that were never solved. They would likely never know the full scope of Keller's violence. All they knew for certain was Jennifer's case, and that was sufficient to ensure he'd spend the rest of his life in prison. On the morning of March 15th, 2024, Detective Sarah Mitchell knocked on Robert Keller's door at 6:30 in the morning. The plan was to arrest him early, before he was fully awake, when he'd be less likely to resist or try to flee. Mitchell was accompanied by her partner, James Rodriguez, and 4 uniformed officers positioned strategically around the house in case Keller ran. But they didn't expect resistance. Keller was 72 years old, with no history of violence beyond the murder they were arresting him for. More likely he'd be confused, would perhaps deny everything, would call for a lawyer. Mitchell knocked firmly, announced, "Police, open the door." She heard movement inside, footsteps approaching. The door opened. Robert Keller stood there in a bathrobe, looking confused, looking like anyone's grandfather awakened unexpectedly, grey hair disheveled, glasses slightly askew. He looked at the officers, at their serious expressions, and his own expression shifted from confusion to something Mitchell couldn't quite read. Resignation, maybe, or recognition that this moment had finally come. Mitchell identified herself and Rodriguez. She told Keller they needed to speak with him about a matter from 1987. Keller's expression didn't change. He didn't ask what matter. He didn't express surprise or confusion. He simply nodded and invited them inside, stepping back from the door, allowing the detectives to enter his home. They walked into his living room, a space that looked like it belonged to any elderly man living alone. Comfortable furniture, slightly worn. A television, currently off. Photographs on the mantel. Grandchildren smiling from frames. Family photos from holidays and birthdays and graduations. Everything was neat, clean, well-maintained. Nothing suggested this was the home of a murderer. Mitchell asked Keller to sit down. He sat on the couch. She and Rodriguez remained standing. She read Keller his Miranda rights from a card she carried, word for word, making sure he understood each right, asking him to acknowledge that he understood. He said he understood. His voice was calm, surprisingly steady. He showed no obvious signs of panic or fear. Mitchell told him they had DNA evidence connecting him to Jennifer Holbrook's murder. She said his name, and Jennifer's name and the word murder in the same sentence, watching Keller's reaction carefully. For a long moment, Keller said nothing. He looked at his hands, folded in his lap. He looked at the photographs on the mantel, his children and grandchildren frozen in moments of happiness, oblivious to what their father and grandfather had done decades before they were born. Then he said, "I'd like to speak to a lawyer." 5 words. Not a denial. Not confusion or outrage or any of the things an innocent person might express. Just an immediate invocation of his right to counsel, which was his right, but which spoke volumes about what he knew and what he'd been living with for 37 years. He knew exactly why they were there. He knew exactly what they'd found. He simply wasn't going to talk about it without legal representation. Mitchell placed him under arrest. She told him to stand, to put his hands behind his back. He complied without resistance, stood slowly, turned around, allowed her to handcuff him. Rodriguez went to retrieve clothes for Keller to wear, since they couldn't transport him in a bathrobe. Keller directed him to the bedroom, told him where to find pants and a shirt. Rodriguez dressed Keller like a child, helping him step into pants, pulling a shirt over his head, managing around the handcuffs. Then they led him outside. The sun was fully up now, neighbors beginning their morning routines. Several saw Keller being led to the police car in handcuffs. Mrs. Patterson from next door stood in her driveway, hand over her mouth, watching in shock. Mr. Chen across the street came out onto his porch, stared at the scene with obvious confusion. Keller kept his head down, didn't look at his neighbors, allowed himself to be placed into the back of the police car. Mitchell shut the door. They drove away, leaving the neighborhood buzzing with speculation and shock, leaving Robert Keller's neat house empty and quiet, the photographs on the mantel still smiling, unaware that the man they celebrated had just been arrested for one of the most horrific crimes imaginable. The arrest made headlines immediately. Retired Denver school worker arrested in 1987, cold case murder. DNA technology solves 37-year-old Thornton teen's murder. Genealogy database leads to arrest in Jennifer Holbrook case. News trucks parked outside Keller's house. Reporters standing on the sidewalk delivering updates. The modest ranch house serving as backdrop for story after story about the elderly man who'd lived there for decades while hiding a terrible secret. News trucks parked outside the Adams County Sheriff's Department, cameras filming the building exterior, reporters interviewing anyone who would talk. News trucks parked outside the home where Patricia Holbrook had lived alone since her husband's death. Patricia, now 81 years old, gave a statement from her front porch. She'd been called by Detective Mitchell shortly after Keller's arrest, had been told that they'd arrested a suspect, that DNA evidence definitively proved he'd killed Jennifer. Patricia had cried on the phone, tears of grief and relief and exhaustion all mixed together, the culmination of 37 years of waiting. She was composed but trembling when she spoke to reporters. She said she had never given up hope that justice would come for Jennifer. She said she wished her husband had lived to see this day, wished Robert could have known that Jennifer's killer had been identified and arrested. She said the arrest didn't bring Jennifer back, didn't fill the emptiness of 37 years without her daughter, didn't erase the decades of grief and anger and unanswered questions. But it meant something that Jennifer's killer would finally be held accountable, would finally have to face what he'd done, would finally be acknowledged as the monster he was, rather than the good man he'd pretended to be. She thanked the investigators who had worked Jennifer's case, both those who had investigated initially and preserved the evidence so carefully, and those who had brought new technology and determination to bear on this decades-old crime. She thanked the genetic genealogist who'd traced the family connections. She thanked the lab technicians who'd developed the DNA profiles. She thanked everyone who'd played any role in bringing this day to pass. She said she hoped other families waiting for answers might take hope from Jennifer's case, might see that cold cases can be solved, that time doesn't always grant immunity to those who believe they've escaped justice, that advances in technology can reach backward through decades to identify perpetrators who thought they'd gotten away with murder. She said she would attend every court hearing, would be there when Keller was tried, would look him in the eye and make sure he knew that Jennifer had been loved, had been missed, had mattered to people who never stopped fighting for her. Then she went back inside, closed her door against the cameras, sat in her living room surrounded by photographs of Jennifer, and cried for the first time in years. Cried not just from grief, but from relief, from the knowledge that she'd finally achieved what she'd fought for since February 1987. Jennifer's killer had a name and a face. Jennifer's killer would face justice. It had taken 37 years, but justice was finally coming home. The community reaction was complex and deeply divided. Keller's immediate neighbors struggled to process the news. Several gave interviews expressing disbelief. The man they knew was gentle, helpful, someone you'd trust with your children. He'd been part of the neighborhood for 40 years, had been a constant presence, had helped people with household repairs, had shoveled sidewalks in winter, had watered neighbors' plants when they were on vacation. How could that man be the same person who had murdered a teenage girl? The cognitive dissonance was overwhelming. Mrs. Patterson told a reporter that Robert had helped her fix her fence just 3 weeks earlier, had spent an entire afternoon working on it, had refused payment, had seemed like the kindest man imaginable. How could those hands that fixed her fence be the same hands that strangled Jennifer Holbrook? She said she felt sick, felt violated, felt like she'd been living next to a monster without knowing it. Mr. Chen said Robert had been friendly for years, had always waved hello, had helped him carry furniture when he'd moved in 15 years earlier. Mr. Chen said he'd trusted Robert, had considered him a good neighbor, had never suspected anything sinister. Now he felt like he didn't know what was real, felt like his judgment of character was worthless if he couldn't recognize evil living right across the street. Others, with the benefit of hindsight, claimed they'd always sensed something off about him, always felt he was too friendly, too eager to help, though none had ever reported any concerns or suspected him of anything. This is a common phenomenon in cases like this, the retroactive rewriting of memory to accommodate new information. People need to believe they can recognize danger, need to believe they would have noticed something if a murderer was living among them. So they create memories of discomfort or suspicion that didn't actually exist at the time, protective fictions that allow them to feel less vulnerable, less foolish for having trusted someone who turned out to be a killer. The truth is that Robert Keller had given his neighbors no reason to suspect him. He'd been careful to maintain his facade, to present himself as exactly what he claimed to be. If he'd acted suspiciously, if he'd given off warning signals, someone would have noticed. The horror was precisely that he hadn't, that he'd been indistinguishable from any other elderly man, that nothing in his behavior had betrayed what he'd done. Keller's children released a brief statement through an attorney expressing shock and devastation. They said they were cooperating with authorities, that they had had no knowledge of their father's involvement in any crime, that they were trying to process information that had shattered their understanding of their family and their childhood. They asked for privacy. They asked that they not be judged for their father's actions, that they were victims of his deception as much as anyone else. They did not visit their father in jail. In the weeks following his arrest, Keller received no visitors except his attorney. His children, who had visited him occasionally before his arrest, stayed away. One of his sons gave an interview several weeks after the arrest, speaking on condition of anonymity. He said he was trying to reconcile two completely contradictory images of his father. There was the father he'd known, the man who'd raised him, taught him to ride a bike, attended his little league games, helped him with homework, supported him through college. Then there was the father who'd murdered Jennifer Holbrook, who'd done unspeakable things to a teenage girl, and then come home and tucked his own children into bed. These two fathers couldn't coexist, yet somehow they had. The son said he was in therapy, trying to process his grief and anger and confusion. He said he mourned for the father he'd thought he had, mourned for the childhood he'd believed was normal and happy, but which now felt contaminated, tainted by the knowledge of what his father really was. Robert Keller was charged with first-degree murder, sexual assault, and kidnapping. The prosecutor held a press conference detailing how genetic genealogy had led to Keller's identification, how the DNA match was scientifically incontrovertible, how they were confident in securing a conviction. District Attorney Amanda Torres stood at a podium flanked by Sheriff's Department leadership and Detective Mitchell. Torres explained the case carefully, walked through the timeline of Jennifer's murder, the investigation, the preservation of evidence, the development of DNA technology, the genetic genealogy process, the confirmation through the coffee cup, the arrest. She was thorough and professional, treating the press conference as an educational moment, using Jennifer's case to demonstrate how modern forensic techniques could solve decades-old crimes. She emphasized that they had absolutely no doubt about Keller's guilt, that the DNA evidence was conclusive, that Keller would be held accountable for what he'd done to Jennifer Holbrook. Keller's attorney, a public defender named Marcus Washington, assigned to his case because Keller claimed he couldn't afford private counsel, entered a not guilty plea at Keller's arraignment. This was standard procedure, the expected initial plea, even in cases with overwhelming evidence, preserving the defendant's rights, forcing the state to prove its case. Washington told reporters that his client was entitled to a presumption of innocence, that he would receive a vigorous defense, that DNA evidence wasn't infallible and would be scrutinized carefully. But privately, Washington knew the case was nearly impossible to defend. The DNA evidence was as close to absolute proof as science could provide. The genetic genealogy had been conducted properly, the coffee cup legally obtained, the chain of custody preserved perfectly. Unless Washington could challenge the DNA analysis itself, which seemed unlikely given the quality of the work, there was no realistic defense strategy beyond hoping for jury nullification or a miracle. Keller sat in jail, awaiting trial. Colorado's bail system allowed judges discretion in denying bail for serious offenses where the defendant posed a flight risk or danger to the community. Given that Keller was charged with first-degree murder and had the financial means to potentially flee, the judge denied bail at the arraignment. Keller would remain in custody throughout the legal proceedings. He was housed in administrative segregation for his own protection, elderly inmates charged with sex crimes and murder facing particular danger from other inmates. He spent 23 hours a day in his cell, a small concrete room with a bed, a toilet, a small desk. 1 hour a day he was allowed out for recreation and shower. He read books from the jail library. He wrote letters to his children that were returned unopened. He met with his attorney to discuss the case, though there was little to discuss beyond whether he wanted to go to trial or accept a plea deal if one was offered. The case never went to trial. In December 2024, 8 months after his arrest, Robert Keller changed his plea to guilty. The decision came suddenly, without warning, catching even Keller's attorney somewhat by surprise. Washington had been preparing for trial, had been planning his strategy, even though he knew it was nearly hopeless. Then Keller told him he wanted to plead guilty, wanted to accept responsibility, wanted to avoid putting Patricia Holbrook through a trial. Washington asked him multiple times if he was certain, explained that a guilty plea to first-degree murder would mean mandatory life in prison without possibility of parole, explained that he'd die in custody. Keller said he understood. He said he was ready to plead guilty. Legal analysts speculated about Keller's motivations. Perhaps he recognized the DNA evidence was insurmountable, that a trial would only force Patricia Holbrook to relive her daughter's murder in excruciating detail, that perhaps even Keller, at 72 years old, facing the end of his life, felt some need to acknowledge what he'd done. Perhaps his conscience, dormant for 37 years, had finally awakened. Or perhaps he simply wanted to control the narrative one final time, to plead guilty on his own terms rather than be convicted by a jury, to maintain some shred of dignity or agency in a situation where he had none. At the plea hearing on December 12, 2024, the courtroom was packed. Patricia Holbrook attended, sitting in the front row, her sister beside her for support. Jennifer's sister Amy attended, bringing her daughter, Jennifer, the niece who bore the aunt's name. Dozens of reporters filled the gallery. The judge, a woman named Sandra Martinez, who'd been on the bench for 15 years, called the proceedings to order. She asked Keller if he understood he was admitting to murdering Jennifer Holbrook. Keller, speaking in a voice so quiet the judge asked him to repeat himself, said yes. The judge asked if he had in fact committed the crimes described in the charges. Keller said yes. That was the full extent of his admission. He offered no explanation, no apology, no expression of remorse. He simply confirmed the facts and sat down. The judge asked if Keller wished to make a statement. Keller conferred briefly with his attorney, then said he had nothing to say. Patricia Holbrook sat in the gallery, staring at Keller's back. This man who'd murdered her daughter, and then lived freely for 37 years while her family suffered. She'd imagined this moment countless times over the decades, imagined confronting Jennifer's killer, imagined what she'd say or do. Now that it was happening, she felt strangely empty. This elderly man in an orange jumpsuit didn't look like a monster. He looked diminished, pathetic, ordinary. She'd expected to feel anger, rage, hatred. Instead, she mostly felt tired of carrying grief for 37 years, tired of fighting for justice, tired of missing Jennifer. The plea hearing was anticlimactic, over in less than 30 minutes. The judge scheduled sentencing for February 2025, giving both sides time to prepare their statements, giving the court time to prepare a pre-sentence investigation report, though the sentence was predetermined by law. Patricia Holbrook attended the sentencing hearing in February 2025, 38 years and 1 week after Jennifer's murder. The date wasn't coincidental. The judge had scheduled sentencing for February 14th, 1 week after the anniversary of Jennifer's death, as though even the court calendar acknowledged the symmetry of finally achieving justice so close to the date when justice had first been needed. The courtroom was packed with journalists, with people who had known Jennifer, with families of other murder victims who'd come to support Patricia, with advocates for cold case investigations who saw Jennifer's case as validation of their work. The atmosphere was solemn and expectant, everyone understanding they were witnessing the conclusion of a story that had stretched across nearly 4 decades, the final chapter in a tragedy that had defined Patricia Holbrook's life. Patricia had prepared a victim impact statement, had worked on it for weeks with the help of a victim's advocate, trying to articulate decades of grief and anger and loss in a few minutes of spoken words. She stood at the podium, her sister Amy beside her for support, and looked directly at Robert Keller as she spoke. She described Jennifer not as a murder victim, but as a person, as her daughter, as someone with dreams and quirks, and a future that had been stolen. She talked about Jennifer's love of Madonna, her collection of ceramic horses, her terrible singing in the shower, her fear of thunderstorms that she'd been trying to outgrow, her determination to become a teacher because she wanted to help children discover that learning could be magical. She talked about the scholarship fund she'd established in Jennifer's name, how over the past 37 years they'd helped send 23 young women to college, women who were pursuing education degrees, women who were becoming the teacher Jennifer had wanted to be. She described the 38 years of waiting, the anniversaries and birthdays marked by absence, the graduations Jennifer never attended, the weddings she never had, the children she never bore. She described her husband's deterioration and death, how Robert Holbrook had died without ever knowing who killed their daughter, how he'd carried that burden of not knowing to his grave. She described family occasions shadowed by loss, Christmas mornings where Jennifer's absence felt like a physical presence, Thanksgiving dinners where they set a place for her out of habit before remembering she'd never sit there again. She described the way Jennifer's murder had sent ripples of pain through decades, affecting not just Patricia and Robert, but Jennifer's sister Amy, her friends, her teachers, everyone who had loved her. She looked directly at Keller while she spoke. He did not meet her eyes, kept his gaze fixed on the table in front of him. She said she wanted him to know who Jennifer was, wanted him to understand what he'd taken, wanted him to comprehend that Jennifer wasn't just a victim in a case file, but a real person with family and friends and a life that mattered. She said she forgave him, not because he deserved forgiveness, but because she refused to spend whatever years she had left consumed by hatred. She said hatred was a burden she'd carried long enough, that she was choosing to release it, not for his sake, but for her own, that she was reclaiming the emotional energy she'd spent on anger and redirecting it toward living whatever life she had left. But forgiveness, she clarified, didn't mean she thought what he'd done was acceptable, or that she felt sympathy for him. She forgave him to free herself, not to absolve him. She said she hoped he would spend every day of his remaining life thinking about what he'd done, about the life he'd taken, about the pain he'd caused. She hoped Jennifer's face haunted him, hoped he couldn't close his eyes without seeing her, couldn't sleep without dreaming of what he'd done in that ditch on that February night. She hoped his final years would be spent in exactly the kind of isolation and regret that he'd forced Patricia to endure, that he'd experience even a fraction of the suffering he'd inflicted on Jennifer's family. Then she sat down, her statement complete, having said everything she'd waited 38 years to say, having looked Jennifer's killer in the eye and made sure he heard Jennifer's name, heard who Jennifer was, understood that his victim wasn't anonymous or forgettable, but a real person who'd been loved. The judge asked Keller if he wished to make a statement before sentencing. Keller stood slowly, supported by his attorney. He looked fragile, had lost weight during his months in custody, looked older than his 72 years. He spoke quietly, voice trembling slightly, the first emotion he'd shown during any of the proceedings. He said he was sorry. 2 words. He didn't elaborate, didn't explain what he was sorry for, or why he'd done it, or what he'd been thinking that night. Just, "I'm sorry," spoken so quietly that people in the back of the courtroom couldn't hear. The judge asked him to speak up. Keller repeated himself, marginally louder. "I'm sorry." Then he sat back down. Patricia found the apology offensive in its inadequacy. 2 words offered after 38 years. No explanation, no real acknowledgement of the enormity of what he'd done. But she also hadn't expected more. What could Keller possibly say that would matter? What explanation could possibly make sense of why he'd murdered Jennifer? Better that he said nothing than offer empty justifications or excuses that would only add insult to injury. Judge Martinez delivered Keller's sentence. She spoke at length about the nature of the crime, the suffering inflicted on Jennifer and her family, the decades of grief and uncertainty that Patricia Holbrook had endured. She noted that Keller had lived freely for 37 years, while Patricia had lived in a prison of grief, that he'd experienced joys and milestones and ordinary days that Jennifer would never have, that he'd raised his children and met his grandchildren and attended family gatherings, while the Holbrook family had empty chairs at their table. She noted that Keller's guilty plea spared Patricia the trauma of a trial, but didn't negate the severity of his crimes. She sentenced him to life in prison without possibility of parole on the murder charge, with additional concurrent sentences for sexual assault and kidnapping. At 72 years old, it was effectively a death sentence. Keller would die in prison. He would never again sleep in his own bed, never again have coffee at the Bluebird Cafe, never again attend church services, or help neighbors, or present himself to the world as a good man. He would spend however many years he had left in a prison cell, surrounded by other men who'd committed terrible crimes, isolated from his family who wanted nothing to do with him, remembered only as the monster who'd murdered Jennifer Holbrook. As guards led Keller out of the courtroom, Patricia watched him go. She felt relief, but not satisfaction. Justice had been done, but it felt hollow. Jennifer was still dead. 38 years had still been lost. Patricia was still alone. The sentencing changed nothing about the fundamental reality of her life, that her daughter was gone and would never come back. But it meant something that Keller would face consequences, that his crimes had finally been acknowledged, that he would be held accountable. It meant something that Jennifer's name had been said aloud in a courtroom, that her life had been remembered and valued, that the world had formally recognized that what happened to her was wrong, and that the person responsible would be punished. It wasn't enough. It could never be enough. But it was something, and after 38 years of nothing, something felt like a victory. Jennifer Holbrook's case became a landmark in the use of genetic genealogy for cold case investigations. Law enforcement agencies across the country began applying similar techniques to unsolved murders, identifying suspects through family connections and consumer DNA databases. The success in Jennifer's case provided a template and demonstrated the viability of the approach, gave hope to other families waiting for answers, proved that even decades-old cases could be solved with new technology and determination. The technique gained acceptance in the legal system, with courts upholding the use of genetic genealogy evidence and the collection of abandoned DNA. As of early 2025, more than 300 cold cases had been solved using genetic genealogy, including cases that had been unsolved for 40 or 50 years, cases that had seemed hopeless, cases that families had given up expecting to ever solve. For families who had lived with uncertainty and grief for decades, these solutions provided a form of closure that had seemed impossible, gave them answers to questions they'd been asking for most of their adult lives. Not all the suspects identified through genetic genealogy were still alive when identified. Some had died years or decades before the technique provided their names. But even in those cases, families valued knowing the truth, knowing who had killed their loved ones, being able to name the person responsible, even if that person could no longer be prosecuted or punished. Knowing mattered. Patricia Holbrook understood this deeply. She'd spent decades not knowing, and the not knowing had been almost as painful as the loss itself. The knowledge that Robert Keller had murdered Jennifer, while devastating, was also a kind of relief. She could stop wondering. She could stop imagining scenarios. She knew what happened, knew who did it, knew that he'd been caught and punished. The questions that had consumed her for 38 years finally had answers. Patricia became an advocate for expanded use of genetic genealogy techniques, working with cold case units and genealogy firms to encourage systematic review of unsolved murders with viable DNA evidence. She testified before legislative committees about the importance of funding cold case investigations, about the need to preserve evidence properly, about the value of giving families answers even decades after crimes occurred. She worked with victims' advocacy groups to support other families navigating unsolved murders, offering the kind of understanding and support that only someone who'd lived through similar trauma could provide. She said she wanted Jennifer's case to mean something beyond Jennifer, to create pathways to justice for other families still waiting, to ensure that the technology and techniques that had solved Jennifer's case would be applied to as many other cases as possible. She felt this was how she could honor Jennifer's memory, by turning Jennifer's tragedy into something that helped others, by ensuring that Jennifer's name became associated not just with murder, but with the solution that brought other murderers to justice. The question that haunts cases like Jennifer's is the simplest and most unanswerable. Why? Why did Robert Keller stop that night? Why did he target Jennifer? What impulse drove him to commit an act of violence that would destroy multiple lives, including, in many ways, his own? Keller never explained. After his guilty plea and sentencing, he gave no interviews, wrote no memoir, provided no insight into his motivations. He maintained silence about the psychological forces that had driven him to murder. Psychologists and criminal profilers can speculate. Perhaps he had committed other assaults that were never reported or solved, that Jennifer was part of a pattern rather than an isolated incident. Perhaps she was his first and only victim, a random encounter that spiraled into horror because of opportunity and impulse and a capacity for violence that had never been expressed before and was never expressed again. Perhaps he had fantasized about violence for years, and that night finally acted on those fantasies. Perhaps something in his life was unraveling in February 1987, some stress or frustration seeking outlet through the ultimate expression of power over another person. Perhaps there was no complex psychological explanation, no satisfying answer to why. Perhaps he saw a young woman alone at night, wanted to hurt her, and did. The randomness is perhaps the most terrifying aspect. Jennifer did nothing wrong. She didn't put herself in danger. She left work at the normal time, drove the normal route. She simply existed in proximity to someone who chose violence. There was no preventing it, no decision she could have made differently, no way for her family to have protected her from a threat they didn't know existed. This is what makes random violence so difficult to process. We want to believe there are patterns, that we can identify risk factors, that if we're careful enough, we can keep ourselves and our loved ones safe. But Jennifer's case proves the limits of that belief. She was careful. She was responsible. She did everything right. And Robert Keller murdered her anyway, because he chose to, because he happened to be on the road that night, because chance and evil intersected in a way that destroyed Jennifer's life. This is the legacy Jennifer Holbrook left behind. Not just the solution to her own case, but the possibility of solutions for hundreds of others. Her DNA, carefully preserved for 37 years by investigators who understood the importance of maintaining evidence even when they had no immediate way to use it, became the key not just to her own justice, but to a new era of cold case investigation. The technology that identified Robert Keller continues to evolve and improve. Genetic genealogy techniques become more sophisticated, capable of building family trees from increasingly distant relationships, capable of identifying suspects even when only third or fourth cousins have submitted DNA to databases. The databases themselves continue to grow as more people submit their DNA for genealogical research, each new submission expanding the web of connections that genealogists can trace backward and forward through generations. Cases that seemed forever unsolved are being reopened and resolved with increasing frequency. Families who had given up hope are receiving phone calls from detectives saying they've identified a suspect, saying justice might finally be possible, saying the case their loved ones waited decades to see solved has finally been broken open. Patricia Holbrook says she thinks about these families often, says she knows exactly what that phone call means, because she received one in September 2023, a detective asking if she could come to the station, saying there had been a development in Jennifer's case after 36 years of silence. Patricia thought her heart would stop. She thought after so many years, hope was dangerous, that allowing herself to believe might make the disappointment unbearable if it was just another dead end, another false lead, another moment of excitement collapsing into frustration. But it wasn't a dead end. It was the beginning of the end, the start of the process that would put Robert Keller in prison for the rest of his life. Detective Mitchell had been gentle but direct. They'd identified a suspect through genetic genealogy. They had DNA evidence that definitively proved he'd killed Jennifer. They were moving toward arrest, but wanted Patricia to know first, wanted to give her time to process the information before it became public. Patricia had cried, great gasping sobs, the kind of crying that comes from decades of held tension suddenly releasing. She'd cried for Jennifer, for Robert her husband, for herself, for all the years of waiting, for the relief of finally having answers. She'd cried because the call had come, because justice was finally possible, because someone would be held accountable for what they'd done to her daughter 36 years earlier. Jennifer Holbrook would be 55 years old now if she had lived. She would likely have taught second grade, as she'd planned, would have spent decades shaping young minds, would have been the kind of teacher children remembered decades later as the one who made them love learning, the one who was patient and kind and funny, the one who understood how to reach kids who struggled, the one who celebrated every achievement no matter how small. She might have married Derek Patterson, or someone else she met in college or later in life. She might have had children of her own, might have been a grandmother by now to children who would have inherited her blonde hair and blue eyes and kind heart. She might have lived in Thornton, or moved away to pursue opportunities elsewhere. She might have traveled, might have seen places she'd only read about in school, might have experienced the world in all its complexity and beauty. She might have been anything, become anyone. The possibilities were infinite, the way possibilities are for 17-year-olds who haven't yet had to narrow their lives into specific choices and consequences. Robert Keller took all those possibilities. He reduced a full human life to a tragedy, a cautionary tale, a cold case file gathering dust in an evidence room. He made Jennifer Holbrook's name synonymous with violence and loss, rather than with the achievements and relationships. That should have defined her existence. He didn't just kill Jennifer that night in February 1987. He killed the teacher she would have become, the wife and mother she might have been, the friends she would have made, the students she would have taught, the grandchildren who would never exist. He killed 48 years of life that should have been lived, 48 years of birthdays and Christmases and ordinary Tuesday afternoons that accumulate into a human existence. He took all of that in the span of perhaps 30 minutes, satisfying whatever twisted impulse drove him, and then he went home and lived the life that Jennifer would never have. But he didn't succeed in erasing her. Patricia Holbrook made sure of that. She kept Jennifer's memory alive through decades of advocacy, through interviews and campaigns, through sheer refusal to let her daughter become a forgotten statistic, another unsolved murder that faded from public consciousness and official priority. The ceramic horses are gone now, distributed to Jennifer's nieces and nephews, who keep them on their own shelves, tangible connections to an aunt they never met, but have learned to love through stories and photographs. Amy's daughter Jennifer, now 15 years old, knows exactly who she was named for, knows the story of the aunt who wanted to be a teacher, who loved Madonna and hated visors and sang off-key in the shower. Young Jennifer says she wants to be a teacher too, wants to honor her namesake by pursuing the dream that was stolen from the original Jennifer. She plans to apply to the University of Northern Colorado, the school Jennifer had been accepted to in 1987, wants to study elementary education, wants to complete the journey her aunt never got to begin. Patricia takes young Jennifer to visit the grave sometimes, grandmother and granddaughter standing together at the headstone that reads, Jennifer Marie Holbrook, 1969 to 1987, beloved daughter and sister, forever in our hearts. They bring flowers, usually irises, because they were Jennifer's favorite. Young Jennifer talks to the aunt she never met, tells her about school and friends and what she's learning, shares the details of a life being lived while Jennifer's remains frozen at 17. Patricia watches these visits with complicated emotions, grateful that Jennifer's memory lives on in this child who bears her name, sad that this is the only connection possible, that Jennifer and young Jennifer will never meet, except across the barrier of death and decades. The memorial garden in Patricia's backyard has become more elaborate over the years. The original stone bench has been joined by a small fountain, by carefully tended flower beds that bloom in rotation from early spring through late fall, by a memorial plaque that lists Jennifer's name and dates, and the simple inscription, "Her light endures." Patricia spends hours in this garden, finds peace there that eludes her in other spaces. She talks to Jennifer, sometimes out loud, tells her about her day, about Amy and the grandchildren, about the latest family news. She knows Jennifer can't hear her, isn't naive about death, but the talking helps anyway, gives voice to the continuing relationship between mother and daughter, maintains the bond that death interrupted but didn't sever. On warm days, Patricia brings her morning coffee to the garden, sits on the bench, watching birds visit the fountain, remembering Jennifer as a child chasing butterflies, as a teenager complaining about homework, as the person she was rather than the victim she became. The advocacy work that Patricia began in the years after Jennifer's murder has become her life's second act, the purpose that pulled her through grief and gave her a reason to continue. When continuing felt impossible. She's testified before legislative committees in Colorado and other states, helped shape laws requiring better evidence preservation, helped secure funding for cold case units, helped establish protocols for genetic genealogy investigations. She's worked with the FBI and the National Institute of Justice on cold case initiatives. She's partnered with genealogy firms and law enforcement agencies to develop best practices for investigative genetic genealogy. She's become an expert through lived experience and dedicated study, someone whose opinion is sought by people working on cold case policy and procedure. She's helped other families navigate the incomprehensible landscape of unsolved murder. When detectives solve a cold case and families need support, processing decades-delayed justice, they often reach out to Patricia because she understands what they're experiencing in ways that even well-intentioned counselors and advocates can't. She knows what it's like to receive the phone call saying they've identified a suspect after decades of silence. She knows the strange mix of relief and anger and grief that comes with finally knowing who and why. She knows how anticlimactic justice can feel when it arrives too late to undo the damage, when the years lost can never be reclaimed. She offers this understanding generously, spending hours on the phone with strangers who've become part of an unwanted community bound together by shared trauma and delayed resolution. She's established a foundation in Jennifer's name, the Jennifer Holbrook Memorial Foundation for Justice, which provides grants to cold case investigations and supports families of murder victims. The foundation has raised over $3 million since its inception in 2005, money that has funded DNA testing, genetic genealogy investigations, and support services for families waiting for answers. Every dollar represents someone who heard Jennifer's story and wanted to help, wanted to contribute to justice for other families still waiting, wanted to ensure that Jennifer's legacy extended beyond her own case. Patricia runs the foundation with the help of Amy and several dedicated volunteers, people who believe in the mission, who understand the importance of keeping pressure on law enforcement to prioritize cold cases, who recognize that unsolved murders don't stop mattering just because years pass. The foundation hosts an annual gala, a fundraiser that brings together law enforcement professionals, genetic genealogists, victims' families, and advocates for criminal justice reform. The event has become one of the premier cold case advocacy gatherings in the country, a place where people working on these issues can network and share information and find inspiration to continue difficult work. Patricia speaks at every gala, tells Jennifer's story one more time, reminds attendees why this work matters, thanks them for their contributions and commitment. She's in her 80s now, her health fragile, but she insists on attending, insists on being present, insists on keeping Jennifer's name and story alive for as long as she's capable of doing so. Robert Keller sits in prison now, an elderly man in an orange jumpsuit, incarcerated at the Sterling Correctional Facility in northeast Colorado. He's housed in the geriatric unit, a section designed for elderly and infirm inmates who require additional medical care and security. He spends his days in a small cell, sleeping more than he used to, reading books from the prison library, watching a small television mounted to the wall. He receives no visitors. His children have not come, have made clear through their attorney that they want no contact with him, that as far as they're concerned, he ceased being their father the day he was arrested. His former neighbors don't write. His former church members don't send care packages or prayer cards. He exists in complete isolation, surrounded by other inmates, but fundamentally alone. He's been assaulted twice since his incarceration, once by an inmate who'd heard about his crime and decided that child killers and rapists deserved extra punishment beyond their sentences, once by an inmate who attacked him for no particular reason except that Keller looked vulnerable and weak. Both times, Keller required medical treatment. Both times, he was moved to more secure housing, kept in protective custody for weeks until administration deemed it safe to return him to general population. He's learned to keep his head down, to avoid eye contact, to make himself as invisible as possible. He eats meals alone in his cell, rather than in the cafeteria where he might be targeted. He showers quickly, always alert for threats. He exists in a state of constant low-level anxiety, always aware that violence could come at any moment. that prison is full of men who consider themselves morally superior to rapists and murderers of young women, men who feel entitled to serve as judge and jury and executioner. Whether he feels remorse is known only to him. He's given no interviews, written no letters that have been made public, offered no insight into his internal state. Prison psychologists who've evaluated him report that he presents as depressed and anxious, but not suicidal, that he understands why he's in prison, that he claims to feel guilty about what he did, though the sincerity of this guilt is impossible to assess. He participates in mandatory counseling sessions, but says little, answers questions with minimal responses, offers no volunteered information about his thoughts or feelings. His psychologist notes that Keller seems to be someone who spent decades compartmentalizing his crime, separating it from his self-concept so completely that he could think of himself as a good person despite what he'd done. Now, faced with the consequences and unable to maintain that compartmentalization, he's struggling to integrate his identity as murderer with his self-image as devoted father and grandfather and church volunteer. The psychologist's report suggests that Keller may have convinced himself over the years that Jennifer's murder wasn't really him, that it was some aberration, some temporary lapse in judgment committed by a version of himself that didn't represent who he really was. This psychological defense allowed him to continue living normally, to interact with his family and community without the crushing weight of guilt that should have accompanied his actions. But imprisonment has destroyed that defense mechanism. He can no longer pretend he's anything other than what the state has declared him to be, a convicted murderer serving life in prison. The dissonance between his self-image and his objective reality has created a kind of psychological crisis that manifests as depression and withdrawal. He exists, but doesn't truly live, going through the motions of daily prison routine without engagement or purpose. He'll likely die in prison within the next decade. He's 73 now, in poor health, with diabetes and heart disease and all the medical problems that accumulate in elderly inmates. The prison medical system provides adequate care, but nothing beyond the minimum required. He takes medications for his various conditions, sees doctors for mandatory checkups, receives treatment when acute problems arise. But he's deteriorating, aging rapidly in an environment designed for punishment rather than comfort, surrounded by stress and violence and the knowledge that he'll never again experience freedom. When he dies, his body will be cremated unless his children claim it, which they've indicated they won't. His ashes will be disposed of according to state protocol, scattered in an unmarked area or interred in a common grave for unclaimed inmates. He'll leave no legacy except the damage he caused, no monument except Jennifer Holbrook's gravestone and the lives he destroyed on February 7, 1987. The question of whether prison serves justice is complicated in cases like Keller's. He's being punished, certainly, spending his final years in conditions far removed from the comfortable retirement he'd been enjoying before his arrest. He's been stripped of freedom, dignity, family connection, all the things that make life worth living. But does this punishment balance the scales against what he did to Jennifer? Can any punishment truly serve justice for murder? Patricia Holbrook struggles with these questions. She wanted Keller caught and punished, fought for decades to achieve that outcome. But now that it's happened, she finds less satisfaction in his suffering than she'd anticipated. His imprisonment doesn't bring Jennifer back. It doesn't restore the lost years. It doesn't undo the damage. It simply removes Keller from society and ensures he can never harm anyone else. That's valuable, certainly, but it feels insufficient measured against the magnitude of loss. She's visited the prison once, not to see Keller but to tour the facility, to understand where Jennifer's murderer would spend his final years. She wanted to know what his days looked like, what his cell contained, whether he was suffering adequately. The tour was disturbing. The facility was cold and institutional, smelling of disinfectant and cafeteria food, and something else harder to identify, some combination of despair and violence and accumulated human misery. She saw inmates in common areas, men of all ages, many looking defeated and broken, some looking dangerous and predatory. She saw Keller's cell, saw how small it was, saw the narrow bed and small toilet, and the barred window that looked out onto concrete and razor wire. She tried to imagine spending years in that space, never leaving except for an hour a day, never experiencing privacy or comfort or anything resembling a normal life. She left feeling complex emotions: satisfaction that Keller was being punished, sadness that this was what justice looked like, awareness that her own life remained diminished regardless of what happened to Keller. The broader impact of Jennifer's case on cold case investigation methodology has been substantial and continuing. The successful use of genetic genealogy in identifying Keller has encouraged other jurisdictions to apply similar techniques to their unsolved cases. Law enforcement agencies across the country have begun systematically reviewing cold cases with viable DNA evidence, submitting profiles to genetic genealogy firms, working through family trees to identify suspects who've evaded traditional investigation methods. The success rate has been remarkable. Dozens of cases solved each year that had been cold for decades, families receiving answers they'd given up hoping for, perpetrators who thought they'd escaped justice being held accountable years or decades after their crimes. The technique has proven particularly valuable in cases of stranger violence, attacks where victim and perpetrator had no prior relationship, where traditional investigative methods had no obvious starting point. Jennifer's case was exactly this type: a random attack where the killer had no connection to the victim, where nothing in Jennifer's life pointed toward her murderer. Genetic genealogy bypassed the need for traditional leads, used biology rather than behavior to identify suspects, made it possible to solve cases that had seemed permanently beyond resolution. The implications extend beyond individual cases to the psychology of crime. Perpetrators of random violence have historically faced relatively low risk of identification if they avoided immediate detection. Time was on their side, evidence degraded, witnesses' memories faded, investigators moved on to newer cases. But genetic genealogy has changed that calculus. Time no longer guarantees safety. DNA persists indefinitely if properly preserved. Family connections remain traceable through generations. The past can reach forward through decades to identify and punish crimes committed long ago. This has deterrent value that's difficult to measure, but potentially significant. Would-be offenders who might have believed they could commit crimes and escape consequences by avoiding immediate detection now face the reality that their DNA could identify them years or decades later, that family members submitting genetic material to genealogy databases could inadvertently provide the connection that solves cases and destroys lives. The certainty of getting away with crime has been fundamentally undermined. This won't prevent all violence. Human behavior is too complex and often too irrational for deterrence to be perfectly effective. But it may prevent some attacks by people who calculate risks and decide the odds of long-term detection are too high to justify the momentary satisfaction of violence. The technique has also raised important questions about privacy, consent, and the appropriate use of genetic information. Consumer DNA databases like GEDmatch and Family Tree DNA contain genetic information from millions of people who submitted samples to learn about their ancestry or find relatives, not to help law enforcement investigate their family members. Using this information for criminal investigations without explicit consent troubles privacy advocates who argue that people should be able to control how their genetic information is used, that submitting DNA for one purpose shouldn't automatically make it available for other purposes. Law enforcement and victims advocates counter that solving murders and rapes justifies using available tools. that privacy concerns must be balanced against public safety and justice for victims, that anyone uncomfortable with law enforcement use of genetic databases can simply not upload their information. The debate continues in legal, ethical, and legislative contexts. Some jurisdictions have passed laws regulating genetic genealogy investigations, requiring warrants or judicial oversight, limiting the types of cases where the technique can be used. Others have embraced it enthusiastically, seeing it as a powerful tool that should be deployed as widely as possible. Consumer DNA companies have adopted varying policies, some allowing law enforcement access with appropriate legal process, others restricting it entirely. The landscape remains in flux, still being negotiated through individual cases and broader policy discussions. Jennifer's case sits at the center of these debates, cited by both advocates and critics, used as evidence for the technique's value and as cautionary tale about its implications. Patricia finds herself speaking on panels and at conferences about these issues, offering the perspective of someone whose life was transformed by genetic genealogy, someone who finally received justice because of this technology, someone who believes the benefits outweigh the concerns but understands why reasonable people might disagree. On a Sunday morning in early spring 2025, Patricia Holbrook drives to Crown Hill Cemetery, where Jennifer and Robert are buried side by side. She does this every year on the anniversary of Jennifer's death, has done it for 38 years now, a ritual that marks time and grief and continuing connection. The cemetery is peaceful this morning, quiet except for birdsong and the sound of wind moving through trees that have grown tall in the decades since Jennifer was buried. Patricia parks in her usual spot, gathers the flowers she's brought, irises in shades of purple and yellow because Jennifer loved these colors, because spring was Jennifer's favorite season, because these flowers represent renewal and hope and beauty, persisting through darkness. She walks slowly to Jennifer's grave, her 82-year-old body moving carefully over uneven ground. The path is familiar. She could walk it blindfolded at this point, has made this journey so many times that her feet know the way without conscious direction. Jennifer's headstone is simple grey granite, the inscription worn slightly by weather, but still perfectly legible. Jennifer Marie Holbrook, 1969-1987, beloved daughter and sister, forever in our hearts. Next to it, Robert's headstone, identical in size and style. Robert James Holbrook, 1944-2003, beloved husband and father, reunited in peace. Patricia had considered adding something about Jennifer to Robert's stone, some acknowledgement that he'd died without knowing justice for his daughter, but ultimately decided the simple inscription was sufficient. Robert knew Jennifer was in his heart. That was enough. She arranges the flowers in the vase permanently affixed to Jennifer's headstone, removes the dead stems from her last visit, makes sure everything looks tidy and cared for. Then she sits on the grass beside Jennifer's grave, something she's done countless times, her body remembering the position, settling into familiar discomfort. She talks to Jennifer, tells her about the past year, about Robert Keller's guilty plea and sentencing, about finally achieving the justice they'd sought for so long. She tells Jennifer about Amy's children, about how young Jennifer is excelling in school, about how the foundation raised record funds this year, about how Jennifer's case helped solve 3 other murders by encouraging those departments to try genetic genealogy on their cold cases. She talks about how strange it feels to have answers after decades of questions, how the relief is real but incomplete, how knowing who killed Jennifer doesn't actually change the fundamental reality that Jennifer is gone and has been gone for 38 years. She talks about getting older, about feeling her own mortality more acutely now, about wondering how many more visits she'll be able to make before her body gives out, and she joins Jennifer and Robert in the ground. She says she's ready when that time comes, ready to see Jennifer again, ready to tell her daughter in person everything she's had to say across the barrier of death for nearly 4 decades. But she's also grateful for the time she's had. Grateful that she lived long enough to see Jennifer's killer identified and punished. Grateful that Jennifer's case contributed to justice for other families. Grateful that her daughter's death, senseless and cruel as it was, ultimately contributed to solving cases that might otherwise have remained perpetually unsolved. She tells Jennifer she loves her, says it out loud the way she's said it thousands of times in this cemetery. The words automatic, but no less sincere for their repetition. She tells Jennifer she's proud of who Jennifer was, of the person she'd become in 17 short years, of the kindness and intelligence and determination that defined Jennifer's character. She tells Jennifer that she's kept her memory alive, that Jennifer's name is known by people who never met her, that Jennifer's story has inspired change and helped other families find resolution. She tells Jennifer that her life mattered, that the years she lived weren't negated by the violence that ended them, that Jennifer was and remains loved and missed and remembered. The sun rises higher, warming the morning air. Patricia sits in silence for a while, just being present with Jennifer, maintaining the connection that death interrupted but didn't sever. She watches birds hop across nearby graves, watches clouds move across the sky, watches other families visit other graves, all of them bound together by loss and love, and the human need to maintain relationships even after death has separated people. Eventually, she stands, her joints protesting, her body reminding her of her age. She touches Jennifer's headstone, palm flat against the warm granite, a gesture of connection and goodbye. Then she walks back to her car, drives home, continues her life. The story of Jennifer Holbrook doesn't end with justice achieved. It continues in the lives Jennifer touched, in the students she never taught, but whose teachers were inspired by her story to enter education, in the families who found justice because Jennifer's case proved genetic genealogy could work, in the laws and policies that were changed because Patricia Holbrook refused to let her daughter be forgotten. It continues in young Jennifer, who carries her aunt's name and dreams into a future the original Jennifer never got to see. It continues in the foundation that bears Jennifer's name and uses her legacy to help others. It continues in Patricia's advocacy work, in every cold case that gets solved because someone heard Jennifer's story and decided to try genetic genealogy, in every family that receives answers because the technique Jennifer's case helped prove was applied to their case too. Jennifer's murder was a tragedy that destroyed lives and created decades of grief. But Jennifer herself was more than a tragedy, more than a victim, more than a cautionary tale about violence and random evil. She was a real person who loved Madonna and ceramic horses, who wanted to teach second grade, who sang off-key in the shower, who stopped to help strangers change flat tires, who had dreams and fears and quirks that made her uniquely herself. Patricia Holbrook has spent 38 years making sure people remember this, making sure Jennifer's name invokes the person she was rather than just the manner of her death. This is perhaps the most important legacy, the insistence that victims of violence are people first, that their lives matter beyond their deaths, that they deserve to be remembered for who they were rather than just for what happened to them. The sun climbs toward midday in Denver. Life continues its normal rhythms. People drive to work and school. Teenagers work after-school jobs. Parents worry when their children are late. Most arrive home safely. The world spins on. But somewhere in those ordinary moments, in those transitions between leaving and arriving, between known and unknown, tragedy sometimes inserts itself, random violence disrupting normal expectations, destroying lives in moments that stretch into decades of grief. Jennifer Holbrook's story is both unique and universal. It's specific to her family, to the community that mourned her, and the investigators who worked her case, and the genetic genealogist who finally identified her killer 36 years after her murder. but it's also representative of thousands of cold cases, of families waiting for answers, of victims whose names deserve to be remembered as people rather than statistics. The resolution of Jennifer's case proves that time alone doesn't equal escape, that even decades later, science and determination can identify those who thought they'd gotten away with murder, that justice delayed is still justice, even if it arrives too late to undo the damage. It proves that families who refuse to give up, who keep pressing and advocating and reminding the world that their loved ones mattered, sometimes get the justice they've sought for so long. It proves that a girl who loved Madonna and ceramic horses and wanted to teach, second grade continues to matter 38 years after her death, continues to drive change and create hope for others still waiting, continues to be more than a victim, but a force for justice, whose impact extends far beyond her own case. Robert Keller may have taken Jennifer's life, but he didn't take her legacy. He didn't take her family's determination to seek justice. He didn't take the meaning Patricia Holbrook created from meaningless tragedy. He didn't take the advances in forensic science that Jennifer's case helped validate and spread. He didn't take the other cold cases that were solved, because Jennifer's case proved genetic genealogy could work. He took 17 years from Jennifer, took the future she should have had, took all the possibilities and opportunities and experiences that should have filled the decades between 1987 and now. But he didn't take everything. Jennifer endures in memory and legacy and impact, in the foundation that bears her name and the families it has helped, in the young woman who carries her name into the future, in the changes to cold case investigation that her case inspired. She endures in her mother's fierce advocacy, in every speech Patricia gives, and every legislative committee Patricia addresses, and every family Patricia supports through their own delayed justice. She endures in the simple fact that her name is still spoken, her story still told, her life still acknowledged as meaningful and valuable, even though it ended far too soon. This is what Patricia Holbrook has fought for across 38 years. This insistence that Jennifer matters, that Jennifer's death demands justice, that Jennifer's killer cannot be allowed to live freely while Jennifer's family suffers, that the world must remember and care about a teenage girl who was murdered on a February night in 1987. The arrest shocked the community that thought it knew Robert Keller, that trusted him, that let him live among them as a respectable citizen while he carried the secret of what he'd done. But the solution to Jennifer's case gave hope to countless families still waiting for their own phone calls, still wondering if they'll ever know what happened to their daughters and sons and siblings and parents, still holding on to hope that one day someone will knock on their door and say, "We've identified a suspect, we have answers, justice is finally possible." Jennifer's legacy is measured not just in her own case, but in the cases her case helped solve, in the techniques her case helped prove, in the families who received answers, because someone preserved Jennifer's evidence for 37 years, and because science eventually caught up with hope, and because Patricia Holbrook refused to let her daughter be forgotten. On cold February mornings in Denver, when the air is thin enough to cut, and the sky holds that crystalline quality particular to Colorado winters, Patricia Holbrook sometimes stands at her window and thinks about that morning in 1987, when Jennifer walked out the door for the last time, when the future stretched ahead with infinite possibility, when no one knew that normalcy was about to shatter. She thinks about all the mornings since then, all the sunrises Jennifer never saw, all the days that accumulated into years and decades of absence. But she also thinks about justice finally achieved, about Robert Keller spending his final years in prison, about other families finding answers because Jennifer's case showed the way. She thinks about young Jennifer carrying the name forward, about the foundation helping solve cold cases, about laws that were changed and policies that were implemented because Patricia kept fighting. She thinks about how love persists beyond death, how connection endures across decades, how a mother's determination can move mountains and change systems and ensure that a daughter murdered at 17 continues to matter 38 years later. She thinks about how Jennifer's story isn't finished, won't be finished as long as there are people who remember her, people who tell her story, people who use her case to help others, people who insist that every victim deserves justice, no matter how long it takes. The sun rises over Denver. Another day begins. Patricia Holbrook, 82 years old, survivor of unspeakable tragedy, architect of meaningful change, keeper of Jennifer's memory and legacy, pours her morning coffee and prepares to continue the work. There are families to support, cold cases to advocate for, stories to tell, memories to keep alive. Jennifer's death was an ending, but it was also a beginning of sorts. The start of Patricia's transformation from grieving mother into fierce advocate, the catalyst for changes that have helped solve hundreds of cases and given hope to thousands of families. This is how meaning gets made from tragedy, how senseless violence gets transformed into purposeful action, how one family's loss becomes a force for justice that extends far beyond their own case. This is Jennifer Holbrook's legacy, carried forward by people who loved her and people who never met her, but were inspired by her story, a legacy that proves that even the worst evil cannot completely triumph, that love and determination and the human capacity for meaning-making can create light even in the darkest circumstances. Jennifer Marie Holbrook, 1969 to 1987, forever 17, forever remembered, forever mattering. Her light endures,